Marion Morris, had long since stopped being dreamy. She had a lot to worry about in this life. Not long ago, her father had left the family, leaving his wife with an invalid mother and 3 minor children alone. The 19-year-old girl was the main helper in this family. Sometimes it even seemed that she had become a substitute for her father. The mother had a quiet, calm character, but she was never affectionate and attentive to her relatives. Especially her indifference lately extended to the elder Marion, whom she more often called Mary, and treated her as if she were a neighbor's girl. Mrs. Kimberly, a mother of many children, had another son aged 11 called Jack and a very young daughter, a preschooler named Cassandra. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Marion was not with Marcus, Kimberly's ex-husband, but with some long-time pal of the woman. Most likely a drinking buddy, she liked to get down to the bottle, just like her husband. But then one day, Marcus had an irreparable event. He suddenly had an epiphany, became more and more interested in newfangled trends for a healthy lifestyle, and attempted various diets. First, Marcus gave up his family's favorite sausage sandwiches in the morning, then all meat dishes. Kimberly began to buy more fish, which her husband had not yet given up, but this did not save their marriage. Marcus then became a raw food eater, and then starved. More and more often, instead of having a glass or two with his wife and friends, he started to go to the forest, walk there for several hours and just enjoy nature. He found adherents on social networks. Almost all of them were men and unmarried. It was interesting for the aspiring vegan to observe the lifestyle of these freedom-loving guys through photos and videos on the internet. And increasingly he was disappearing outside the house, away from his family, his children, his wife, and his sick mother-in-law, with whom his relationship never worked out. I felt life. I had to change something in my destiny. He shared these sentiments with his friends more and more often. And then one day, lying on the sofa after another inspiring walk, Marcus looked at his wife and fussing children and realized he had to leave. As Marcus packed his things, Kimberly just lay motionless in the room. Sometimes it seemed like she was sobbing, but she had found out about her husband's decision a couple of days before he left, had an argument with him, even a bit of a fight, and then just realized there was nothing she could do about it. Marcus put his arm around his son and kissed the still uncomprehending Cassandra, who had been asking him all the way, "Dad, when are you coming?" And her question remained unanswered every time. Then the prodigal father, ready to leave the house with his bags, where a taxi was waiting for him in the street, looked at Marion, who was standing aside. He approached her slowly and said, "Marion, look for yourself." The girl looked at him questioningly. "Look for yourself. Look inside, you have a light. You're going to make it." "Okay," the daughter answered confusedly. This large family was left alone, without a father, without a breadwinner, without a protector. Now both mother, grandmother, and Marion, as the oldest members of the family, began to think more and more often about how to feed the children. Marion had felt lonely almost from childhood. She had friends, some of her classmates stayed in town. Most of them had moved to places more suitable for earning and living. One such friend was Gabrielle Jones. She had known Marion since first grade. They both sat in the fan seats at the outdoor stadium, where town sporting events were often held. Marion decided to tell her friend about the recent changes in their family. "So anyway, my dad left my family." "Really?" Gabrielle put both hands on her head, trying to act dramatic. "Yeah, he just left. Packed his things, said goodbye, said some rubbish to me." "What kind of stuff?" "Yeah, it was bullshit." Marion smirked. "Look for the fire inside," said the girl. Gabrielle laughed out loud, followed by the storyteller. They were both rolling on the floor with laughter. But then, calmed down, Marion went on again. "Yes, he's been strange lately. To tell you the truth, I didn't feel sorry for him." "Strange? What do you mean?" "Going into the woods, not eating meat, and all that." "Yeah." And anyway, Marion looked away and smiled faintly. She took out a packet of cigarettes. "What?" "What? Say what you want to say." "I don't even know." It was obvious that Marion hesitated to tell her, or to keep secret what lurked in her soul. She didn't know whether to tell even her best and time-honored friend at such moments. "Marion, we've known each other so long. Maybe I'm worried." Gabrielle bought her friend a smoke and she gave in. "Yeah, they say he's not my father. I don't know whether to believe it or not." "That's weird, who's saying that?" Mrs. Cheryl from up the street, Mom and Dad's friends. I haven't heard it myself, but it's all come to me recently. It's so annoying to be told you've heard it somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about it now. Yes, said Gabrielle thoughtfully. All evening and all night Marian worried about her decision to tell her friend about the rumor, for even she did not know if it was true. Marian had worked before her father and family left, but it was more of a part-time job than a full-time job. She handed out leaflets. She was a sales consultant in a clothing shop. She traveled with goods to various addresses in the city as a courier. Now it had been decided by the family council that Marian would go to New York to work. Kimberly had already managed to call her sister, who worked in one of the grocery shops of a large chain in the city. Catherine was a receptionist and had once long ago offered Kimberly a job at an open sales position. Kimberly had been taking care of the younger Cassandra at the time, and Marian couldn't sit with her since she was already moonlighting somewhere. When Marcus left, she remembered her sister's offer. It was Marian's first day of work. She was to come to the shop and talk to Mrs. Catherine and listen to a short lecture on her job description. Marian took her packing seriously. She put on dark trousers and her best, almost unworn jumper. Her mother saw her fiddling in the mirror and putting on her makeup. "Why are you going to be a shop assistant?" she said squeamishly and almost indifferently, standing on the threshold of her daughter's room. Marian made no reply. She had long ago reduced her intercourse with her mother to a minimum and spoke to her only on business. She loved her, of course, but it was easier this way. Marian had long felt that her mother's attitude to her was mainly consumerist, and she did not want to be personally convinced of it. This woman seldom cared for the girl's personal problems. Her name had long been associated in this family with the words, help, do, and fetch. It was a long drive from small town to big New York City, where Marian had only been a couple of times in her entire 19-year-old life. She was riding on the bus and listening to her favorite music on the player, looking around at the surrounding farms and small towns along the way. Suddenly, she felt sad. The girl thought about her life in her childhood. It turns out I hardly had one. She remembered quite the early years when there were 3 of them. Her mother and father. They had been younger, funnier, and friendlier then. Her mother would hug her at times, kiss her forehead, and her father would joke merrily, tossing his little girl in the air. Father and mother drank less. They were lively, but then brother Jack was born and relations in the family, for some reason, deteriorated. Marian was only 8, and she already had to almost run from school to sit with the baby. From then on, the girl began to feel that she was no longer perceived as before, as a daughter, as a girl, as a living person who had a beating heart inside. More and more often she began to hear, "You must, don't forget," and other words containing requests, if not orders. And less often she received words of approval, care, and love. When Cassandra was born, Marian realized that she was certainly not going to have a carefree life now, and she was right. Jack went to school, and Kimberly had her 3rd child. Marcus began drinking more and participating less in the family's life. His wife, who had many children, soon had to look for work, as he quit his job and started looking for work himself. These searches were passive, and every time he was asked about his progress, he sadly replied that there were no suitable vacancies yet, that the salary at the interview was lower than the stated salary. There were many other reasons why he couldn't get a job at his working age, being a fit and healthy man. Kimberly understood that he had no desire to get up every weekday from his favorite sofa and deny himself daily drinks with friends and watching humorous TV shows and series about the police. But what was to be done? Her husband's temper was sometimes harsh, and he could, even when he was in a depressed mood, use his hands, but not against the children. All in all, Kimberly knew she shouldn't have disturbed him. She had also hoped that he would be involved with the kids, but that wasn't happening either. You did your homework and clean up after yourself. That was usually the extent of her father's attention. During this period, Kimberly began to look more and more closely at her eldest. She was already 14 years old when Cassandra was born. One day she told the girl bluntly, "I'm working, money is tight. You need to get a job too." Marian was a serious child, and after a month she started bringing in a small income for the family. She barely had enough for her own needs. She gave almost everything to her mother. Once Marian dared to ask her why her father did nothing, and then she regretted it for a long time. So many negative words and emotions in her direction she had never heard before, became very offended. And at that moment, everything changed in her soul. If her mother did not become her enemy, then her attitude to her, seemingly to the most dear person, became indifferent. Soon Kimberly noticed this change in her daughter, and instead of discussing with her the reason for her reticence, she began to respond in the same way. They were both bound together only by their concern for Jack and Cassandra. Marian became a second mother to these children. Kimberly was not only absent from work, sometimes she arrived very late, and no one knew what the real reason for her delays was. The sick grandmother was out of the picture in this family, and in that she and Marian were alike. She lay in her room and occasionally chatted with her grandchildren. There were medicines lying everywhere, and there was almost always a television on. Marian liked to share some of her less than obvious experiences with her, but as time went on, her grandmother began to feel worse and worse. She was in the hospital or just sleeping. Her grandchildren visited her less and less. On her face one day appeared an expression of indifference to life. All these moments of her life replayed in her head mysterious black-browed girl sitting on the last row in the bus, and sometimes her eyes filled with tears. Well, at least we'll have more money, so she comforted herself at the end of her heavy thoughts. Soon the announcement was made. New York terminus. Marian sighed. She wanted to ride in this old bus, to look at the trees at home and just think, dreaming of a better life that might never come. Marian got off the bus and slowly made her way towards the city center. The stop was located on the very outskirts of town. She saw a few older houses. They were located on an elevated area. The further she traveled towards the shop, the more modern scenery she encountered. Finally, she saw a large grocery shop. It was beautiful, all glass and with glowing letters on the roof. It was a very huge building. Marian walked inside the premises. There was an escalator running right in front of the entrance. On the ground floor, there were little stalls with balloons, with unusual lollipops and different bling. And all this colorful picture briefly caught the eye of a girl from a small town, who did not often come to such crowded places. First, she wanted to buy a beautiful knitted bracelet with stones. Then she looked long and fascinated at the golden statue of a dragon. "I'd like to take one of these home," Marian dreamed. After about 10 minutes of excitement, she remembered that she had not come to go shopping, but to get a job in a grocery shop. But where was it? So it's a shopping center, I guess, she thought. The signs said the grocery shop was on the first floor. At the shop, Aunt Catherine met her niece and immediately started telling her about the duties. There were a lot of them, and one had to listen carefully. Marian knew that Catherine didn't like to repeat herself and took her personality very seriously. Perhaps that was why she and Kimberly didn't get along very well. Her sister in conversation could take offense at nothing, but seriously. Marian was issued a uniform. She was assigned a mentor, a petite blonde woman of about 45 named Selena. She spoke quietly and quickly, sometimes even slurring her words. The girl's first day as a trainee was hectic but unnoticeable. With her anxious thoughts and running after Selena, Marian didn't notice how her shift ended. 9 p.m. "You can pack up." Her mentor walked up to her. "What about you?" "Me too. Let's go to the back room and change there." "Did I work well?" Marian asked. "Yes, you've been fine. It's hard to tell from the first day." Marian calmed down. For some reason, she thought she had made a lot of obvious mistakes, but it turned out that her mentor did not notice anything, or considered all her faults as insignificant. Either way, she was glad for the end of the day, even though no one had praised her. The main thing was that she hadn't messed anything up. So a month passed, and Marian received her first salary, as well as her new position as a sales consultant. The probationary period past this event was the main success she had had recently. One day she came home and found her mother at home, peacefully making soup in the kitchen. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to share her achievement at work with her. She went into the kitchen, and she and her mother exchanged a few words. "No, I won't," Marian thought. "She's all about the money, and that's all that matters." Soon Marian had established herself in her position at the shop. She did her job splendidly and had no complaints about life. She was given a pay rise and once even made Employee of the Month. She was now used to sharing her successes only with herself. Her friend Gabrielle got married and moved in with her husband in Chicago. At times, Marian thought of her and even envied her happiness a little. Yet on the whole, she was content with what she had. The girl had become truly independent. And it was not only about financial independence. because now she could afford to spend more on herself. In addition to all this, she changed personally. She didn't need company at all. She didn't want to talk or listen to anyone. She worked and helped her mother with her children. It would seem that what else was needed for her? A person who had long been deprived of any ambitions. And yet she wanted to love. Marion tried to get into relationships with guys, but after a few short attempts she realized that she didn't want to be with just anyone to have fun and arrange romantic evenings. All these young people were not in a hurry to be serious about Marion. "You're a little too outspoken." Gabrielle had hinted to her in the days when they still lived in the same town. "You're a bit, I'm sorry, not feminine, are you?" she once said. Marion tried to hide the feeling of offense, but she had a great complex in her heart. She was indeed a little coarse, her voice was low, her features, though beautiful, were in many ways boyish, her nose with a hump, her slightly extended manly lower jaw, and her eyes, those brown, thoughtful eyes, in which something deep, secret, and serious was read. It had been 2 years since Marion had taken a job with Aunt Catherine. She was 21 years old and in love. Stephen Howard worked as an area manager for a shopping center and occasionally went into the shop to check on the quality of the staff. He took a fancy to an unusual black-browed girl, and she took a fancy to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His expression always conveyed good-naturedness, and the high-browed, bony blonde named Stephen was liked by all the cashiers and saleswomen in the shop, and they were not shy about exchanging a few enthusiastic words among themselves after he left. Stephen had come on board later than Marion had started working here. For 6 months they exchanged glances, but one day Stephen did get bold enough to make the first move. She was standing at the meat counter. The shop was unusually small and the clerk had nothing to do. It was the right moment for the two of them. She heard behind her, "Girl, why are we standing there? Why are we not working?" It was funny that Marion, who was tired of working days from domestic cares with her brother and sister, at first reacted to the manager's remark sharply and negatively. She turned round and stared at the man with her deep and intense gaze, squinting her thick, dark eyebrows. "I work when there's work to be done. Are all the shelves filled with merchandise? Customers don't need counseling? Is the warehouse in order?" In a monotonous and slightly raised tone, Stephen bombarded the young saleswoman with work-related questions. She stood in silence for a few seconds, not taking her stern gaze off the man, of course, realizing that she would be in trouble if she continued to be rude. It was obvious that she was facing a representative of the management. However, being in a bad mood and hurt by the phrase about idleness in her address, as well as unpleasant questions that sounded like complaints, she could not keep her discontent to herself. "I've worked here for 2 years and no one has ever complained about me. If you want to be the first to do so, be my guest." Marion had that unpleasant quality from childhood. She sometimes could not hold back her sudden anger. She'd had a couple of fights at school, the so-called shooters. There were also attacks of uncontrolled aggression, but all these moments were rare because at home reigned complete indifference. And it would be strange to behave in such a way when neither mother nor father even asked you questions about your affairs, not to mention serious conversations about studies, personal life, or smoking. Standing in front of a shop management representative. For the first time in years, Marion remembered her peculiarity. Her face was covered with color, her eyes glistened, and in her soul there was both dislike and fear for her position, without which she had not seen a full life for herself and her family for a long time. Everything hung on this fragile girl. Suddenly, the stern expression on Stephen's face changed to one of mortification and contentment. He looked at the name on her badge and said in a good-natured tone, as if afraid of her hurt feelings, "Marion, I don't know your patronymic, but I can see that you are a man of character, and I hope you have a good sense of duty. A man like you should be. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I am here to make our business grow and become as profitable as possible." Marion made no reply, but felt as if the manager still had something to say. She was not mistaken. And he continued after a short pause. "How do you get on here?" "I can't complain," she mumbled. She wanted to go to the warehouse, but sensing that the beautiful and daring and even more beautiful girl wanted to leave, Stephen decided to act immediately. He had already spent 6 months looking for her casually through the stalls. "Marion, let me give you my number, so you can be my assistant and keep me informed of how things are going in the warehouse." Marion smirked. She had calmed down a bit, and instead of irritation, there was curiosity. "What do you want me to do? Rat out my colleagues?" "I'm sorry, doing what?" Stephen smiled just as amiably. "Marion, I'm just collecting employee numbers. But they're on the database, if anything. The manager was not angry with Marion. On the contrary, he found her a very interesting person, and all her mockery, inappropriate grimaces, like a lack of etiquette when talking to the bosses, only made him angry. He wanted to know more about the girl. All right, in base, I'll write to you, go to the warehouse. Marion went away. She was filled with one great and vivid feeling. No, it was not anger. It was love at its most embryonic stage, when we are not yet sure of our feelings, and are ashamed of ourselves, ashamed of our thoughts about the person, for we know nothing about him. The same thing was happening to Marion when she just stood in the warehouse by the boxes and did not move, because her new thoughts prevented her from concentrating. Manager, what did he want from me? Bullshit. After a peculiar interaction with the new employee, Stephen approached Selena. Who is this hooligan you have working here? He smiled at the saleswoman. Morris. Selena sighed. I think she's Mrs. Catherine's niece. That's all I know. How's the job? We're responsible. Not bad, helpful. All right, thanks, I'll be off. Stephen left the shop in a pleasant thoughtfulness, and afterwards thought for a long time about the young tall brunette with a serious and beautiful look of big brown eyes. For a long time, neither Marion nor Stephen forced themselves to continue this informal chat. Stephen arrived a couple of weeks later. He didn't write or call her as he had promised. After chatting with the manager, the man in love immediately approached Marion and said in a loud voice, "We need to talk. Please go to the warehouse." There were salesgirls and the manager around, still not far away, and the manager did not at all want to be judged by the junior staff here in the future. He was merely pretending that he intended to reprimand the salesgirl. Marion was frightened for a moment, forsook thoughts of the beauty of her lover's eyes and lips, which in a fortnight had bored her, and thought of the dreadful thing, which was the word dismissal. They both walked slowly towards the warehouse. There was no one there, and the only witnesses to Stephen's forthcoming revelations would be the numerous boxes of foodstuffs. Marion, I'll tell you straight away, no complaints. She looked questioningly at her boss. I like you here, round and round. I do not want to go round. I want to try to communicate with you. She looked somewhere to the side, down, and smiled sweetly and embarrassedly, as if wanting to answer something. Her lips involuntarily shook, and a slight, but still noticeable to the interlocutor paint, covered all her beautiful face. Well, you think, here's my number. Marion took from the man a small white card with printed lettering and logo. As he walked away, she examined it. Stephen Howard, business consultant. Below it in even smaller print was a list of his services and his phone number, the most important thing for which this business card had been handed to her. It was a beautiful time, spring. It was around this time that Marion and Stephen began dating. They didn't advertise their relationship. The territorial manager came to the shop as usual, a couple of times a month, and communicated only with those with whom he was supposed to communicate by work. He and Marion even tried not to look at each other. One day during a smoke break, Selena brought up Stephen. There were 3 female shop workers standing outside in a circle. They should have finished their smoke break sooner rather than later, as the shop was left to 2 people, one of whom was a young girl who, just like Marion, had come here a couple of years ago and knew next to nothing. Molly, the cashier, put out her cigarette butt on the rubbish bin and, carefully dropping it there, walked off into the building with a quick step. Selena and Marion took quick puffs to finish their cigarettes and go to their seats. And our Stephen's all right, Selena, who was not particularly noted for her participation in gossip, replied cryptically. Who do you mean, Selena? Marion asked, though she knew it could only be about the manager. Stephen Howard. Yeah, he seems nice. Marion, are you 2 dating by any chance? Selena asked, and the question changed the expression on her colleague's face. No. What makes you think that? Well, I don't know, it just seemed like an experience. I don't know what your experience is. You're paying attention to the wrong things, Marion snorted unfriendly. Maybe not, but just in case he's just not your best option, it's best not to get involved. Marion didn't say anything back to her. She was surprised by her colleague's words. She didn't understand why Selena started to be frank about her boss, and why she was so sure of their connection. The saleswoman wasn't fooling her, though. She had indeed speculated and just guessed that was what was called experience. The quiet, silent worker, who had never been seen discussing colleagues before, suddenly decided to share her suspicions about Stephen with the young employee. Perhaps Selena recognized Marion as herself, and Stephen resembled someone from her past life. The feelings and thoughts that had prompted her to talk remained unknown to Marion. Marion had been her own person for a long time, and she made all her own decisions. She didn't rely on anyone, and she didn't count on anyone. Stephen was a ray of sunshine that had suddenly come into her life. He was a real grown man, capable of courtship, gifts and displays of affection. Marion had never met a man like him before. All the few partners she'd had were boys, not men, and it wasn't even a matter of age. All they could offer was a trip to a cafe and a sleepover at their house when her parents were away. Stephen, on the other hand, was a wealthy man. He was 30 years old and had already been living alone for several years in his own flat, which he had partly earned himself. His parents were honorable, educated people and wished their son a similarly honorable party. They were both university professors, and many of their students seemed to them good candidates for the role of their son's future wife. But Stephen often referred to the busyness at work and did not come to these nice acquaintances, and if he did, all communication ended with a banal gesture of propriety. He walked the student home and wished her good night. It's not like that. Each time Stephen complained to his parents, begging them to stop these useless acquaintances. His father and mother were genuinely perplexed and asked their son what he wanted. And he only answered, "I'm a grown-up uncle. I'll sort it out myself." So what did the 30-year-old territorial manager of a large grocery chain, Stephen Howard, really want? Firstly, the man was somewhat annoyed by any desire of people, even his closest relatives, to dictate his life. He was used to being the king of his life, and only circumstances that happened to us not of our own free will could change his trajectory. No one in this world was an authority to him, only himself. Some of Stephen's acquaintances called his characteristic overconfidence, and more than once he was advised to listen to the opinions of others, and yet he did things his own way. When he succeeded in his career, he clearly realized that he was on the right path. Strangely enough, he had no clear goal in matters personal. Stephen did not strive, as his parents put it, to find a worthy party, although he was already 30. Perhaps romance lived in this purposeful and pragmatic man. There wasn't much of it, but he, just like his new love Marion, believed that you just had to find your man. It didn't matter to him that his girlfriend hadn't accomplished much in life and worked at the grocery shop in the lowest position. He liked her dark, always, as if on something focused eyes and rough, but at the same time so beautiful and attractive features of the face. Yes, he felt in this difficult, silent girl his own man. Marion had almost ceased to sleep at home. Her mother, of course, was not happy with her, although now their financial situation had improved markedly, and her daughter threw a certain amount of money into her account every month. Since Marion began to date Stephen, the amount became even greater. It was because the young man was giving her money for personal expenses, which meant that the mother was now allowed to throw even more money. Marion understood and didn't argue with her when she spoke. "You have decided to pay us off," she replied. "Yes, you may consider it so," and went to work and then to Stephen's house for the night. Stephen was in no hurry to offer to move Marion into his flat. What was it he couldn't exactly figure it out himself? Perhaps it was some insecurity about his feelings. Or maybe, despite his independence, he was still afraid of his honorable parents and ashamed of the 22-year-old shop assistant who had been his girlfriend for 6 months. In any case, after some time in the soul of this successful man, there was a certain dissonance. He as if began to slowly retreat back. 6 months later came the crisis in this unequal relationship. Marion, tired and broken, came home more and more often to spend the night. Stephen looked for all sorts of excuses not to invite her over. Her mother smirked one day when she saw her daughter on the doorstep late at night. "What, did he leave you?" Marion answered her nothing, by the way. She did not tell her a word about her young man. And so several months passed. Both did not know what to do to end this relationship once and for all, or to continue to meet in the same format, but experienced constant psychological discomfort. They arranged a warm meeting on Valentine's Day. It was a chance to set the record straight, to forgive each other for offenses and deal with misunderstandings and understatements. As luck would have it, Marion got some unpleasant news. One of the saleswomen was sick, and there was no one to work the night shift. "Marion, but I'm begging you to come out. You'll be well paid," the manager begged her. but I have plans for tonight." Marion replied grudgingly. Probably if the manager had known with whom Marion was going to spend the evenings then, she would certainly have looked for someone else. "I'm begging you. I'll get on my knees." "All right, Bridget, don't. I'll go out." A sense of responsibility had been instilled in her from childhood, not by her mother, not by her father, but by life. And Marion couldn't refuse to help the shop she'd been working in for over a year. Still at the end of her shift, she kept walking around, twisting and turning the phone in her hands, typing and deleting text again. For some reason it seemed to the girl that if she didn't make it, her and Stephen's relationship would be over forever. Yes, she had become a little dependent on him. She liked his advances, the fact that he was a wealthy and mature man, but most importantly, having had no experience of a really serious relationship with men before, Marion quickly got used to him. Somehow she thought that this choice was the best, and she would never get another chance to find a suitable life partner. Stephen was indeed good-looking and well-to-do, but did he love her? She didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in the back of her mind, her heart felt unreciprocated. Finally, it was 9 p.m. The second shift had begun. Marion knew she had to be at Stephen's at 9:30 p.m. She had to dare to text. "I'll write it as it is. He'll think I'm responsible. He's the boss here," Marion tried to reassure herself. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen. One new message. It was Stephen. What was he trying to tell her? Marion opened the message. "Sunshine, please forgive me. I can't make it today. I'll be in an important meeting." How easy and convenient it is, being a member of the administration, to refer to important, usually unscheduled meetings. Stephen had used his position more than once to make up another story about these very important matters, but Marion had no choice but to believe him. After all, if there was no trust, then why keep in touch with the man? She wrote him that she was also busy, that she was put on the night shift, using the warmest and sweetest words. Stephen felt sorry for his girlfriend and wished her a brisk shift. Almost 3 hours passed, there were less and less people in the shop, and thus less work too. Marion was thinking more about her personal problems than about customer requests and groceries. It was unusual for her to work after 9 o'clock, and she was beginning to feel a little drowsy. There was a sudden appearance. Scarlett appeared in the shop, the same sickly shop assistant. Marion was a little puzzled. What was she to do now? "Marion, hi. It's okay, I can do it. I'm free," the woman said. "Yes, but Bridget." I rang. Marion shrugged. She went to the back room to change. She hated to humiliate herself in front of Stephen, but his flat was the only place close to the shop where she could spend the night. She realized he had no intention of seeing her. He might already be asleep or out of the house, but it was still better than catching a taxi in a foreign city past midnight. Maybe he'll at least pay for my taxi, she thought. As it happened, Marion had hardly any money with her, and she certainly wouldn't have enough for the ride home. After 3 messages asking for a bed for the night, or at least for help, Marion began to call Stephen, but all her efforts were in vain. He must have been very busy. She stepped outside, breathed the fresh February air into her chest, and headed for the bus stop. There are times when you know you're doing something reckless, but you walk on, as if you're too lazy to stop, think, and make another, more difficult decision. That's what happened to Marion, who all in her thoughts walked slowly to the bus stop, knowing that all the buses had long since gone away. Marion sat down on the bench once more, checking her phone just in case. It hadn't received a single call, not a single message. Of course, she could have called one of her friends and mates, asked to borrow money and hail a taxi. She could have gone back to the shop and spent the night in the back, but her eyes fell on the very few old houses she had noticed the first time she had come here for a job interview. The houses were old and shabby, but still people lived there. Marion was sure that on the ranch there would be some old man or woman who would be kind enough to shelter her till morning and give her a good meal. At least that's what fairy tales and good films and serials about lost people teach us. She walked towards the houses. A window was burning in one of them. Without thinking long, Marion headed towards the light. She approached the wicket, in the yard of the property through the darkness. The girl saw a large foreign car that looked like an SUV. Though the wicket was closed, the hook could be easily lifted from outside the lot. Marion decided to go in to knock on the door. She reckoned that was what the locals here did. Slowly moving around the lot, she got a little look at the property. There was probably a garden under the windows. There were pegs sticking out from under the snowdrifts that looked like the planks of an ornamental fence. There were fruit trees growing close to the fence. She knocked on the door, and a man soon came knocking. "Who's there?" said a tall male voice. "I missed the bus. I don't know what to do." Well, the man said slyly. He sounded elderly. Marian saw before her a skinny old man a little taller than herself, with a long beard and sparse long hair. He was gray-haired. His thin features did not have a particularly aged look. On the contrary, there was something naive, childlike about them. The old man looked at Marian and smiled. He expected to hear her story. "I didn't catch the bus. I don't know what to do." "Aha, aha." The grandfather said fluently, "I heard that. In short, I don't want to beat around the bush. Can I sleep over?" "Sure, come in, come in." Marian at first became frightened. Crossing the threshold of the house, she felt some hostile aura and even wanted to leave. But the old man turned and said good-naturedly, as if sensing that his manners were not to the liking of the uninvited guest, "We have only good people here, and everybody knows me, and I know everybody. Don't worry, girl. Lie down in a small room and rest until morning." The lively interest in his eyes and sly voice dissolved somewhere, and Marian became easier to communicate with this man. She remembered about the foreign car in the yard. "Do you drive?" My son drives. He comes here with his wife. This time he decided to leave it here. I don't know why." Grandpa went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and from the kitchen I heard something. "Do you want something to eat?" "No, thanks." "Well, at least store-bought cakes with tea," replied the guest. While grandfather was fussing in the kitchen, Marian began to look at his home. It was quite decent. There was a plasma TV on the bedside table, and although the furniture was simple and old-looking, the house was clean and tidy. The sofa was populated with a new bedspread of expensive fabric. It seemed as if someone was constantly caring for this dwelling, and judging by the nature of that care, it was hardly the owner. "Yes, my name is Michael Taylor." An elderly man came into the living room with a plate of cakes in his hands. "Marian." The girl sighed tiredly. "Are you sleepy? I'll get some tea." He left again, and Marian felt her heart finally calm down and beat in a familiar rhythm. Marian ate the cakes and drank tea alone, and the master went away again. He came half an hour later and announced that the room was ready. She had gone to spend the night in a strange place, lying in a strange bed, and this moment, of course, embarrassed her. Lying under the covers, she stared at the burning screen of her phone. Such a strange thing was happening to her. She wanted to share her impressions with at least someone, but then she realized, who should I write to? And having put the phone on the bedside table, she fell asleep in the sound sleep of a baby. Tired and spiritually distressed for the day, Marian decided to get out of bed as soon as her eyes opened for the first time that morning. Despite Michael Taylor's apparent hospitality and kindness, she felt uncomfortable being in someone else's home. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 5:27 a.m. Getting up at this hour was certainly difficult, but still Marian made an effort on herself. "If I pack quickly, I can catch the bus," she thought. Marian sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched, slowly so as not to wake the elderly owner of the house. She tucked her phone and charger into her bag, looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall, and opened the door to the living room as carefully as she could. The landlord was apparently asleep. He was lying on the sofa, covered with a plaid, with his back to the exit. A few steps separated the girl from the exit. She paused. Maybe I should thank him. At least say something. No, I won't make the bus. She turned towards the door and continued her slow step. After a few seconds, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It couldn't be anyone else. Marian turned around. A satisfied Michael Taylor stood in front of her with a sly smile that pushed her away. Still last night. It wasn't as if the man had just woken up. It was as if he had been invisibly watching his guest since the moment she awoke. Marian became frightened. She was a truly desperate girl at times, and yet she was the weaker sex. And there was a strange man standing in front of her, and this man was clearly not going to let her go. Michael now seemed stronger, taller, and more confident to her. Were these sensations contrived from fear, or had the master, all the time the girl had been in his possession, been trying to appear feeble, bending and grimacing to make Marian believe he was pitying her? She did not know, but it was urgent to get out of this house and not make a mess of things. "Darling, where are you going? And who's going to pay for it?" He gave his victim a sly look. "Look, I'm going to leave now. I have no money, but I'll pay you back. Now I can." Marion began to dig frantically in her bag to find her purse. She pulled it out and took out several 100 notes. "Hisham," the old man chuckled softly. "Do you have a phone number? I'll text it to you or your son. Here's 400. Put the money away." Breathing heavily, Michael said. The elderly owner abruptly sat down and began to pull off the girl her dark, tight skirt, which she had decided to wear the day before, as February had been warm and sunny lately. Marion immediately began to struggle with the rascal. She tried for his shoulders to push him away from her, but he pressed himself against her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Marion felt as if she were falling. They lay struggling for a while. Michael slapped Marion on the cheek. "Shut up and obey, or you'll get in trouble. I'll say you attacked the old man." Marion didn't expect that this man could be so dangerous and strong. She started to scream, and he immediately put his hand over her mouth. Feeling that he had little strength to completely defeat the girl, Michael began to beat her mercilessly on the face, trying to suppress her will, but he did not know that Marion had in her soul so strong an undisclosed anger that only give the will to show itself and terrible things would happen. This anger was like a sleeping bear that had been teased by people. The more they irritate him, the stronger his desire to tear his offenders, and only the cage separates fools from death. Unfortunately for Michael Taylor, a lusty old man, who thought of raping a girl in unpleasant circumstances in the middle of the night, Marion was a warrior in her 22 years. She herself didn't fully know what she was capable of. The blows to her face had pissed her off, and she no longer saw the lonely old man in front of her as a monster and a murderer. Marion bit into his neck, and he loosened his grip a little and groaned. Still, it wasn't working to break free from his tight embrace. Michael continued to beat his victim. At some point, she felt sick to her stomach and decided that this was the end. She was ready for violence to stay alive. Her skirt was almost off. The scumbag was already fumbling with her underwear. Marion could not stand this nightmare. She suddenly screamed so frantically that Michael was just in a daze and finally let her get free. It seemed to run free, call people for help, but this feeling couldn't stop. It was charged and demanded some sort of outlet. Marion, strangely enough, in defiance of the sense of self-preservation she had had until a few minutes ago, took a sharp step towards the kitchen. From there she picked up the heaviest-looking utensil, a cast-iron skillet, and dashed into the room. Before she realized it, Michael was lifting himself up on his hands to get up, but he was still sitting on the floor. He instantly became the victim, not the hunter. Terrified, the old man looked at the furious girl with the frying pan and only had time to open his mouth, probably preparing an exculpatory speech, pitying words to be pitied and spared, but it was not to be. A blow, another blow, and he fell to the floor, sprawled on it senseless. Marion didn't know if her attacker was still alive, but she immediately called an ambulance and the police. She sat at her desk in a small armchair beside the body of her failed rapist and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Thoughts of criminal responsibility began to cross her mind. At 16, when she was still at school, she'd been interested in the law for a while. At home, there was a thick book on the shelves called Legislation. At first, Marion just opened and closed it, and then for fun began to learn by heart the names of articles and their numbers. The number 105 came to mind. Would I get 105 or not? Would I have a chance of not going to jail? This is self-defense. Marion was not sure that she would not be given the article for murder, but she was more inclined to manslaughter. In any case, the girl was scared, because in front of her, perhaps there was a corpse of a man and an elderly man, and she was in someone else's house. Marion went to the mirror. Her face was already beginning to show signs of beatings, and that was to her advantage. She calmed down a bit, sat back in her chair, and continued to wait for the police and ambulance. Finally, after half an hour, Marion waited for the one she had been anxiously awaiting. It was still dark outside, and the people of the neighboring houses must have been asleep, but on hearing the noise of the cars, the gawkers hurried out from behind their fences, and there were those who formed a large crowd around Michael Taylor's property. Murdered my granddad, the bastards, thieves, I suppose. He'd been giving up lately. These and many other phrases from the gawkers could be heard by ambulance and police officers. What happened? shouted a woman from the crowd. "We're looking into it," replied the paramedic briefly. People wanted the truth. They were eager to know it. They couldn't just leave the place and wait for the first rumors from the most clever neighbors in the area. Michael Taylor was generally well regarded by the people, though he had not lived here long. Most people thought he was a peaceful and quiet grandfather, cared for at times by his son and daughter-in-law. The police asked Marion a few questions, to which she answered as honestly as possible, believing there was nothing to hide, and concealment of the facts of what had happened, as she knew, was punishable by law. The girl was put into a police car, and as she walked along, accompanied by 2 men in uniform, people stared at her in silence. When she got into the car, people started whispering among themselves again. "What a nightmare. These young people have gone," shouted someone from the crowd. A little later, the doctors finished their work and carried out an elderly man on a stretcher. His face was not covered, and the villagers, seeing this, breathed a sigh of relief. The police had left, the ambulance had left, forensic experts had rushed to the scene. There was nothing to see here, as they were mostly inside the house. People went to their homes to sleep, and some people went about their daily business. The women, who were particularly impressionable, could not recover from what they had seen for a long time. They became afraid for their own lives. Nothing illegal had ever happened in this area, and no one, of course, did not expect that a murderer would come to the quiet place where mostly pensioners lived. A little later, grandparents began to go to each other and discuss what had happened. Some were even pleased that something worthwhile could finally be discussed. Barbara stopped by to see her friend Vanessa. "Vanessa, did you hear? Did you see what happened? Everyone's alive, old people are being slaughtered." "Why, what was Michael's problem?" "Yeah, I saw and heard. I was standing there this morning." "What do they say?" "She's a young girl." "She was young, but the weird thing is, she called the police and the ambulance." "Wait, what are you doing?" Barbara glared at her friend. "You're justifying her." "She's not here. I'm just saying it's weird. They're all bastards. They don't spare us old people. She came in, she wanted money, she wanted to make a profit, and Michael turned her down." "Yeah, I guess that's what happened." Prejudice was firmly planted in the woman's mind. She couldn't imagine anyone making excuses for someone who'd done grievous bodily harm to an elderly man. Not she. No one else in the area wanted to think that Michael Taylor was at fault, even though everyone knew that the girl had not run away but had stayed at his house until the police and ambulance arrived. And everyone knew about the oddities of the grandfather living at the entrance to the village. Marion was young and healthy, her victim, on the contrary, elderly and weak. And who would have thought that he wanted to rape his overnight guest, who out of desperation had risked spending the night with one of the residents of this ill-fated neighborhood? The investigation began. Michael was still in intensive care, but the doctors gave him a positive prognosis. Marion recounted all the details. She indicated the approximate time of events, talked about the nuances, answered all the questions put to her. In general, actively cooperated with the investigation, and the investigators saw that she was sincere, and her eyes were burning with the desire to get out of the detention center as soon as possible, to be acquitted. It was not only her unenviable position that marred Marion. Perhaps even more unpleasant was the fact that during her 5 days in the detention center she had never been contacted. There had been no messages or calls from either her mother or Stephen. Marion had wanted to call them both several times, but had hesitated. Something kept her from doing so. She wanted to be interested and waited for the call. So she felt that besides anxious thoughts about her future fate, she had other worries on her mind. And though they were not good either, yet in this way the girl was able to dilute her fear a little. Marion realized that she needed a good lawyer, and she still couldn't stand it. And while the investigation was dragging on and Michael had not yet come to his senses, it was worth worrying about her defense. After 5 days in the detention center, she called Stephen and told him everything. "Really, why didn't you call before?" he asked in confusion. "I was hoping you would call." Stephen had nothing to reply to these words. He really hadn't been concerned about her all these 5 days. Marion had only called the shop manager, and Marion thought that she might have told the others about her trouble. But to her surprise, her beloved Stephen knew nothing. "Do you need a lawyer?" he asked Marion. "Yes, I'm ashamed to ask for your help, but if you don't, no one will." "Tell me, didn't you defend yourself?" "Yes, I told everything to the investigation. Why such questions, Stephen?" Marion experienced emotional tension, and was even annoyed when she heard the words of doubt from Stephen. He hurriedly reassured her. "Marian, it's okay, calm down. At least come and check on me. The lawyer will be you in which detention center you are sitting." Marian told him the number of the detention center. When she hung up, she realized that he didn't even want to visit her. He was evasive. Marian never called her mother. Somehow she wasn't particularly surprised by this. Disinterest in her daughter's life was a trait that had characterized Kimberly almost all her life. She had always regarded the girl as an obligation. And now, after a week without hearing from her, she concluded that she would come forward sooner or later. But if she is in distress, this important question was absent from the mother's mind in grief. "Morris, you have a visitor." Marian heard from the guard. A lawyer had come to see her, and her first question to him was, "Who are you from?" Stephen had not lied. He had sent his man to her, and he was ready to take up her case seriously and intimately. Mr. Christopher immediately reassured the defendant. "It's not a difficult case, just tell it like it is." Marian sighed, having to recall again the terrible story of the lustful owner of the house on the edge of the city. After about 20 minutes of careful listening, Mr. Christopher, a thin man, brunette, glasses, with a concentrated face, crossed his palms and moved a little closer to the accused. "You've done well. This is all very important. I think we're going to win this case." "I'd like to believe that." Shaking her head slightly, sadly, looking somewhere away, Marian said, "You know, by the way, that our Michael Taylor is already in the ward. Awake, will soon testify." A strong color stuck to Marian's face. She was frightened. This must be bad. "Believe me, I have a lot of experience in these cases. He won't make it. Of course he'll tell his stories. It's a very good thing you're left with a clear beating. You have no motive. You stayed at the scene of the crime. Nothing was stolen. You can just calm down and wait for the exit." Mr. Christopher collected his papers in his briefcase, and after saying goodbye and wishing Marian patience, he left. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Well, you tell me, come on." A large, tall man in shirt and trousers almost ran into the room. He looked about 40 years old and was in an agitated state. "How did they let you in? Quarantine?" The grandfather looked at his son in surprise. "Dad, they let me in, and let me in." The man sat down on a chair near his father's bed. He looked at him patiently, waiting for some explanation of what had happened. "Why, you don't know anything yourself, lawyer." "Dad, I know everything. I want to hear you. Is she some kind of psychopath?" "She didn't even take anything. She wanted to kill me." Michael got up from the bed in a state of near rage. Well, calm down, Dad," calmed his son, gently put his hands on his shoulders. Lie down, rest if you want. Let's not talk about it now." "No, you started it. I'll continue. Sadist, she wanted to kill me." "How do I know why?" Michael Taylor was clearly in a bad mood. His son Edward was determined to derail the conversation. In between asking him questions about his health, about the hospital kitchen and the doctors, he decided that he would have to come again when his father had calmed down and was ready to talk about what had happened in his home without emotion. For Marian, the time spent in the isolation ward dragged on at a terribly slow pace. Mr. Christopher had failed to fully convince her that her actions would qualify as self-defense. Some uncomfortable feeling could not leave her, as if everything was not so simple in this case. On the eve of the hearing, Mr. Christopher once again went to see his client. He was in high spirits and simply confident of victory. "Marian, don't worry. Everything will be fine. Tomorrow be sure and say everything as you told me. You were in agitation, plus self-defense, attempted rape. That'll put our Michael Taylor in jail," Marian's lawyer said with a smile on his face. The convict was silent for most of this conversation, just nodding and occasionally speaking. "I see." The closer the trial got, the more anxious she felt. The night before the trial, Marian remembered her mother, brother, and sister. She had a strange feeling that the family had a life of its own, and that they were not her own people. Little by little, she began to involuntarily forget their images and memories associated with the house. The trial began in the morning. Marian prepared herself for the trial. She had her hair combed and even put on a little makeup and wore a clean change of clothes that she had taken with her to the detention center. She looked like a normal, decent, and civilized girl. The image at the trial had to play a positive role. In her case, it was important. Many had already labeled Marion a dangerous criminal, a marginal and a thief. There were rumors that Michael was not the first victim of the killer, and that she dealt exclusively with lonely pensioners. But this time she had a serious client. Everyone in the area knew of Marion's blunder. Marion sat behind the bar and watched the people entering the hall. She said hello to Mr. Christopher, and he once again cheered her up by saying, "It's going to be fine." Marion Morris. Some of Michael's neighbors came in. Marion hadn't seen them, of course, and wouldn't remember them, but they were elderly people, outwardly different from the city folk, and she concluded that it was Michael's support group that had come. She saw him too, but immediately looked away. He still disgusted her. Sitting next to him was apparently his lawyer, a tall, statuesque man in his mid-40s. The most unexpected thing for the defendant happened when a woman and her teenage son, who were very familiar to her, entered the courtroom. It was Kimberly and Jack, Marion's mother and brother. She stared at them for a long moment, wonderingly trying to meet her mother's gaze. Jack waved his hand to his sister, but her mother immediately cut him off. She did not look at her daughter, feeling that she was looking at her. Why did she come here? And with Jack thought Marion. The hearing of the case began. When Michael's lawyer introduced himself to Marion, she turned pale. His last name was Taylor, the same as her abuser's. She stared at his face, then shifted her gaze to the victim. Yes, they did look alike. Was it really his relative? His son Marion no longer expected anything good from this trial. Though her defender, Mr. Christopher, looked quite confident in his statement, but when his opponent began his speech, he began to listen carefully to his words. The speech was filled with complex language, and everyone with a little knowledge of the law realized that this man was serious and knew his case well. Many were also struck by the emotionality with which he spoke about the case. Especially attentive guessed what was the reason for such an ardent concern of the lawyer to the old victim, who risked to become the accused that day. Alas, it did not happen. Against all sound logic, against Mr. Christopher's efforts, and against all the facts that had been presented to the court, Marion was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for robbery. Hearing the judge's words, Mr. Christopher's face changed. What assault? He addressed the judge so that no one could hear him. What's the matter with you? Mr. Christopher, sit down and calm down. You'll appeal if you have to. The judge answered him calmly. The man looked shattered. He had lost a rare event in his 20 years of practice. Marion saw the bailiffs as they approached. She watched Mr. Christopher's face, hoping he would look at her, though she didn't know why she wanted to make contact with him. He stood gloomily for a moment in one place, and pretending to be so puzzled that he had forgotten Marion, walked slowly towards the exit. Mr. Christopher, what now? Marion shouted. The bailiffs had already entered the defendant's cell, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Christopher disappeared into the crowd of spectators leaving the hall. Marion was still in the detention center for some time. She kept waiting for Stephen's call, still unwilling to accept the fact that she would soon be a prisoner. Maybe they'll reconsider, appeal, she thought, sitting within the 4 walls of this horrible room she was never supposed to enter. Finally, Marion got a phone call. It was her young man, though she wasn't sure anymore. His voice was initially depressed, and that didn't bode well for Marion. Well, what is it? In a pleading voice she asked. Yes, Marion, you see, Mr. Christopher is a very good lawyer. I paid him a lot. He didn't expect this, you know. The thing is, this Edward, he's the freak's son. But not only that. What else? He's a powerful lawyer. I heard that Michael, this weirdo in there with them, did not want to live with them in the city. Wanted to his native village, where he grew up. All these long summarizations were not only unnecessary for Marion, but also irritating. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked Stephen. Why are you telling me all this? Is it bad or not? Marion, I don't have that much money. Mr. Christopher told me the amount, but it's a lot too. Others will take even more. And this one is an acquaintance. How much, Stephen? Marion asked, almost crying. Well, 1 million. We, of course, on friendly terms agreed that half of the amount in case of loss he will return. But you know, 100,000,000 I cannot get nowhere. But it's just 1 million. Stephen, I'm going down, you know. There was an uncomfortable silence at both ends of the wire. Stephen kept silent because he didn't want to offend or upset the girl. Marion said nothing. She waited for his final answer. Marion finally softly spoke Stephen. Well, first of all, it is a colony of settlement. It is not strict regime, and secondly, well, 5 years and parole. I'm sure you will go out on parole. These words were too horrible for Marion. She hung up the phone. Marion, hello? On this day, Territorial Superintendent Stephen Howard decided to take no further interest in this girl's life. When she tried to call him for help and made her most fatal and possibly stupid decision of her life to go to a sleepover with a stranger, he was having a great time with a nice lady who had been waiting for reciprocation from him for a long time. Lately, Stephen had been unsure of his feelings for the young and simple girl Marion, because one way or another he was influenced by the opinion of those around him. He was independent and had no authority, but one day he himself thought that he felt uncomfortable in the company of a shop girl, or maybe he just took and changed because people change. Marion Morris, a 24-year-old shop assistant at a grocery shop chain. The girl, circumstances that one day did not work out in her favor, went to the colony. At first she was scared, but fortunately in the colony of settlement lived, and quite decent, not broken by prison women. It was to such women that the newcomer tried to get closer. Still, sometimes she had to show her teeth here. Like in the men's prison, this colony had its own chief or pahanka. Her name was Jennifer, and this was the 4th time she had been here. One had to respect this imposing woman with a not very feminine tattoo on her arm. There were always a few female settlers walking beside her like jackals. All of these women were unpleasant in appearance. From their appearance you could roughly determine their articles. One was a thief with experience. Another killed her husband in another drunkenness. But Jennifer herself, already in the 4th time, caught in a major fraud. She began her dirty career with an assistant to a serious businessman and part-time criminal mastermind of the city, and it was back in the 90s. Young Jennifer liked to live life to the fullest, and even after the first walk, she decided not to stop there and become even more successful. Except that the woman never wanted to earn according to conscience. She had no children, no husbands, and somewhere in her hometown remained an unhappy mother. Not long ago, who learned from neighbors about the criminal biography of her daughter, Jennifer all told her that she went abroad for a long time, and she piously believed her and even rejoiced for her in anticipation of seeing her only beloved daughter again. But through one of her neighbors, the truth was accidentally revealed. It was before Jennifer's last conviction. She and her mother had had a terrible fight, and in her heart, her daughter called her some very nasty words and left. A few weeks later, she had another case she wanted to drop because it was quite a risky move, but remembering the difficult conversation with her mother, she decided, okay, nobody needs me here anyway. And again, Jennifer and several of her partners had to go to jail for fraud. Marion was settling in. It wasn't so bad. She found something new to do here. She started sewing often, even when her working hours were over. She was also fond of beading, and this activity calmed her and temporarily removed all bad thoughts from her head. Somewhere in the sewing room on a shelf there was a magazine with weaving schemes. That afternoon Marion studied it and asked one of the inmates, the shop manager, to get some beads so that she could make crafts from the magazine. Margaret, the supervisor's name, was a kind and understanding person, and to Marion's delight, in a couple of days she brought her a large amount of material for her new creation. Her meditations, sitting on her bunk and threading the little balls on the thread one by one, Marion began to forget all her troubles, enjoying her work, which almost from the beginning she had been doing well. Interrupting her positive thoughts, 4 women entered the cell. Jennifer was among them. Marion was afraid of this bulky woman, partly because she almost never walked alone, and many colonists had told of her cruelty. Jennifer looked at Marion with a contemptuous smile, who pretended not to notice the women who had entered the room. But how could she not notice them? "What are you doing in business, new girl?" Marion's plowwoman asked impudently. Realizing from Jennifer's tone that she did not come in peace, Marion decided not to answer anything. "I made up a nickname for her, beads," shouted one of Jennifer's 6. All but the main one appreciated her friend's joke and laughed too. It was an unpleasant sight. These ladies were clearly out of the local color of the colony, which in general was not so bad. "All right, I'm not supposed to be quiet around here. Last name, first name." Jennifer spoke. "Marion Morris." Marion put her work aside and looked at the woman. The newcomer's eyes were full of a confidence uncommon to newcomers, and a kind of desperate insolence, which was of course bad form for someone like her. "Are you so bold?" Jennifer asked in surprise. Marian again made no reply, thinking the colonists' behavior a provocation. Her behavior offended the unspoken leader of the colony. Well, I hear you've been weaving your stuff around here, that you've started selling it, but that's not the way it works. So 80% of your shit is coming to me. Look, it'll be under control. Marian remained stubbornly silent. She picked up her weave and continued working as if they had all left the cell. Have you learnt everything? No, Marian answered. But then, now the girls will crush you a little. And for a few moments Jennifer waited. She hoped that Marian, under the pressure of the threat, would agree to her unprofitable business plan. But alas, she gave her friends a gesture, and they began to approach Marian. A fight broke out. Jennifer, as former prisoners, calculated everything. Almost no one was in the building of the colony. All went to community service. The administration was usually eating lunch at this time, and there were no guards here to monitor the prisoners. Marian didn't scream for help. She wasn't the tiniest girl, but she had never been in a fight before. She reckoned that this was her first time as well, for against Michael she was rather just defending herself. Of course she couldn't do it against 3 men, but she remembered the feeling of overwhelming rage she had felt when the man responsible for her mangled fate had touched her underwear. Jennifer's girls had had it. For one ended with a broken nose, for another with a black eye and a nail-scarred cheek. Still, Marian was beaten. She lay on the floor, holding her stomach. It only hurt, but surprisingly she did not feel fear, resentment, or despair that day or later. Marian lay on the floor for some time, beaten by the felons, though she was able to get up. Then she crawled quietly from the floor to her bunk and put her hands on her head. She thought about her future fate in this place. Jennifer, strangely enough, had stopped pestering the needlewoman who had appeared in the colony and had told her own not to hurt her either. Morris, don't touch her. She's a hard woman of ours. I heard that she wanted to kill the old man who was bothering her, she told the girls. The colony's chief gangster even developed a certain sympathy for this young prisoner with a beautiful and rare name. Marian worked exclusively for herself, giving her trinkets to the girls and women with whom she most often socialized, or even selling them. One day, one of the prison authorities took an interest in her work, and that's how Marian got her first big money in prison. The work was painstaking, but the necklace of pink flowers came out simply amazing, and all in joy the customer paid her $2,000 for her hard work. Soon Marian decided to follow the example of some other women from the colony who had been in captivity for a long time and were beginning to go mad from the monotony of their lives. Some of them also began to weave beads, and some of them sewed clothes from patterns, and there were also those who simply embroidered cross-stitch, so to speak, for the soul. And you have brought creativity into our society. Look, everyone is doing something. Lillian sits all day long and embroiders her flowers. Yes, I can see it's fun, Marian smiled. Linda was the nicest person she had ever met. She was not only interesting to talk to, but also to share her feelings. This prisoner had a feeling of caring for Marian and her fate. She was the first to hear the story of the lustful old man from whom she had to defend herself. At first, Marian's story shocked her, and she could not calm down for a long time, asking her friend about the case, whether it was possible to appeal against the court decision, and whether there were people ready to fight for her. Then, having learnt that the girl had a bigger problem in her free life than her criminal record, namely the complete indifference of all her relatives and acquaintances, including her mother, Linda calmed down and stopped asking her uncomfortable questions and just sympathized with her. A year passed. No one had visited Marian once during that time. At first, listening to stories of women about how their visits with their mother, with their son, with their husband had gone, she became sad and even at times wanted to cry. Then she got used to this pain and dissolved in her daily activities. So in beating, community service, socializing with good girls from the colony, and thinking about life after prison, 2 more years passed unnoticed. Marian turned 27 years old. She was young, beautiful, and forced to sit in jail only because she had prevented a lusty old man from being abused. A few days after her birthday, which she celebrated in a tight circle of good friends, Linda among them, she was summoned to the office of the colony director. Marian was terrified and told Linda about the event. "Yes, wait, why are you nervous?" Linda hurried to calm her friend. "I don't know, what if I did something wrong? Maybe it's because of the sale of their products." "Well, you told me that Cheryl Jones ordered something from you." "Yeah, that's why it's weird. I've been trying to remember for 3 years. and I can't figure out where I went wrong. Look, what makes you think it's something bad? What's good? Marion grinned nervously. The girl, even though she liked the life in captivity lately, she was counting the days until she left the colony. She had only 2 years left, and again she could live as a human being in freedom. However, thinking about it a little deeper, she began to get a little upset. I'll get out, but what then? Where to go? I won't go to my mom. I won't go to Stephen, but he won't expect me. Marion knew that she would have to look for a job and a place to live. And these thoughts burdened her, and yet Marion looked forward to freedom. Like most of the women in the colony who'd come here, some for robbery, some for theft, and some like her by coincidence by life's injustices. She walked slowly to her boss's office, fearing not only bad news from him, but illegal actions. Now, after the incident with Michael, she was afraid of strange men, and willy-nilly in ambiguous situations the girl was frightened. She became uncomfortable and frightened. Marion Morris, why are you standing there? I'm waiting for you. The headmaster, a man in his 50s with a full head of gray, looked out of the office. Hello, Marion replied briefly. William Butler, that was the name of the director of the colony, politely asked the prisoner to sit down. As she entered the office, she immediately noticed the woman sitting at the large desk to the left of the director's desk. Now she was no longer so afraid of William Butler. The woman was Amanda Hill, a social worker who had worked with the female prisoners here for a long time, and she had a kind face. The colonists loved Amanda. Yes, she could not solve all the burning questions of her wards, but she always sincerely tried to help people in their trouble. And just a personal conversation with her was sometimes a balm to the soul of these women. Amanda had no children, and she seemed to give all her motherly love to them. Marion Morris, how are you enjoying your stay in our institution, so to speak? William Butler chuckled slightly at his own words, shifting his gaze from Marion to the teacher. It's fine, I like it. Marion was startled, and it was noticeable. Marion Morris, can I ask why you're so tense right now? Amanda addressed the prisoner. I'm worried, Marion replied. Why should you be worried? Smiled William Butler, who, according to Marion's findings, had been a lively and cheerful man that day. There was silence. William Butler was staring at some papers. Perhaps it was a file on the prisoner Morris. Amanda Hill was careful not to let Marion notice her gaze. All right, ladies, well, Marion Morris, your lawyer, Mr. Christopher, has filed a motion with the court for your parole. How? Marion was surprised. Didn't you know anything? No. Marion was confused. Stephen hadn't reported in for 3 years. Was it Mr. Christopher's own initiative? She could not believe that she might be able to get out of the colony early. The prisoner's face changed visibly. She was radiant with joy. But she tried not to show it and listened attentively to William Butler. So you talk to Amanda and she'll tell you everything. There'll be a medical examination soon, mind you, and then the trial. In general, I've written you the most positive characteristic, because we here with comrades know about your hobbies, that you sew there, or beadwork, you're about to do it, and that you have a positive influence on the inmates of the colony. In general, the main thing is not to worry and believe in the best. So the court will decide. Marion asked anxiously. Yes, the court will decide everything, but we are for you. Marion thanked William Butler for the good news, and together with Amanda they went out to talk. As they wandered around the large colony grounds, they chatted about the parole process. Marion asked the educator with great interest about how it would go and what she herself had to do to be granted parole. At night before she went to bed, she was full of bright new impressions and thought of Mr. Christopher. Why did he help her? Marion was quite sure that the man had already forgotten her in that unpleasant case. It had been a long time since she had thought of him, but as it turned out, he not only remembered, but was willing to help her. The medical board found no reason to deny Morris parole. A little later, a hearing was held in the local court, where the only familiar face in the room this time was Mr. Christopher. The hearing was quick and successful. The result was the granting of the application for conditional early release of the convict under the article robbery, which meant that in 10 days young, beautiful, and still not broken, believing in the best, Marion Morris was waiting for her long-awaited freedom. She already knew about it from the words of ex-criminals who had once been released on parole. It was the beginning of March. Although the whole earth was still covered with snow, and in general in nature there were almost no signs of spring, Marian felt it with all her body and with all her soul. She wanted to shout, "Freedom." But the girl's quiet disposition prevented her from doing so. She stood for some time near the high fence with barbed wire, smoking and greedily gulping the air, which this day seemed much sweeter than before. Well, Marian went to her hometown, and this time she had money with her, and there she rented a place to live. In this she was helped by one of her acquaintances, with whom they had established good contacts while Marian was still in the colony. They began to communicate even more often than before. No one helped Marian with work. She soon found a job as a saleswoman at a cash register. The problems of the former prisoner began almost immediately after the beginning of life on the outside. It was not bad, and Marian liked it very much. A fresh start, perhaps, so she imagined her future fate when she was behind bars. But a couple of weeks later, a manager approached her at work when she was putting the goods on the shelves. "Marian, can I have a word with you?" "Yes, say it right here." "What are you talking about?" Marian asked, engrossed in her work. "Marian, it won't work here. It's important." They both went outside. The weather was fine, it was April, and it was even hot at times. "Marian, you see, today I was told from above. They say that you do not meet the qualification requirements here." The manager was very embarrassed. It was hard for her to inform this hard-working girl, who from the very first days of her work in this small grocery shop began to show enthusiasm and professionalism, that she was fired. "I see I don't fit in." Marian grinned. "Marian, what can I do?" "I was told to tell you." "Yeah, it's all about the criminal record. I know it's not your fault." Even though Marian was depressed that day, she knew there was no point in trying so hard to please the manager. She finished the day perfectly, without any complaints. "I'm sorry to see you go," her boss told her as she walked her out the next day. Marian just smiled sadly and walked to the bus stop with a cigarette. She smoked more and more often and worried about her future fate. It was an unpleasant day for Marian. She realized that she had no money to pay her rent and no success in finding a new job. She didn't want to be a beggar to her mother, but she decided to visit her family, at least to see her brother Jack and sister Cassandra. She stood for a long time in front of the windows of her home, hesitating to enter. It was her pride. In 3 years, her mother had never once bothered to find out about her. How could it be? Suddenly, her mind was full of different thoughts. What if something had happened to her? What if Marian, horrified at her own reasoning, went with a quick step into the flat? It was late in the evening. Everyone must be at home, and she rang the doorbell. It was Marian. She answered briefly to the sound of the inner door opening. A male, unfamiliar voice was heard in the distance. Another minute of fussing outside the door, and she was opened. "Marian, what are you doing here so early?" It was not a joke. It was a real misunderstanding on her mother's part, and Marian did not know whether to laugh or cry. In simple words, she was not welcome here. She walked to the living room. Her sister Cassandra was sitting there watching cartoons. Is it really her, Marian thought. The girl was all grown up, had grown-up features. Marian. Cassandra broke away from the TV series and ran up to her older sister. Marian couldn't contain her emotions. She took the girl in her arms, even though she was already overweight, and spun her around a little in front of her. "Cassandra, have you grown so big? You're 13, aren't you?" "Wow. I'm 13. And you're 20? Marian stared at her sister. Then her face turned from surprise to full of joyful emotion, and she laughed. "Cassandra, are you doing well in maths?" "How much?" Marian wondered. "I won't tell you." An unfamiliar man entered the room. He reluctantly said hello to his guest. Matthew. Matthew was tall and broad-shouldered and looked to be about 50 years old. Marian. "Nice to meet you. I'm your mother's husband." "I see." Marian replied quietly. Also, a lot had changed here, but not her mother's attitude towards her. "Mum, where's Jack?" Marian asked her mother at the table. They had all sat down to supper. "Jack lives alone now, not far from here. Would you like the address?" "Yes, of course." "Are you going to sleep over?" "No," said Marian modestly. "Come on. Where would you go at night? Do you have a place to stay or not?" Kimberly tried to be a bit of a caring mother, but she was not very good at it, and it didn't last long. The housemates persuaded Marian to stay the night and prepared a cot with clean linen. Before going to bed, Kimberly visited her daughter and they chatted about the detention. Marian talked about the future and the good lawyer, Mr. Christopher. And then her mother, for the umpteenth time in this life, upset her. "Marian," said gently and quietly to Kimberly, "I beg you very much, don't pretend to live here. Matthew and I are living so well, Jack has moved out, I'm finally happy. You understand me as a woman." "Mum," said Marian, "I'm not claiming anything." And that was the end of the conversation. They said goodnight to each other, and then Marian packed her things and left. Before leaving, her mother wanted to slip some note into her pocket. It was only 500, but Marian grinned sweetly, handed the money back and said, "Leave it, it's more important to you." She looked at Cassandra, who was as always staring at the television, even though the day was just beginning and she didn't even notice that Marian was leaving. The touching feeling she had for her was still there. She was a little sister, but Marian realized that everyone here would always be a stranger to her, and 13-year-old Cassandra was becoming more and more like her mother, losing her naive and childlike image. "Cassandra, at least go say goodbye to Marian." The girl reluctantly started and walked towards the corridor, all looking back at the TV screen. "Well, Cassandra, goodbye." Marian walked wherever she was going. She was only paying a month in advance, which meant that in a week or so she would have to move out due to not being able to pay for the room. She just wanted to wander around her hometown. Tears came to her at one point as she thought of her mother's words to her the night before. Marian hadn't been lying when she said she didn't need a place to live. She herself did not want to live in a flat with a strange man, and a man who would never be her family, who was only nominally so. Mother, who is this? Is it only worth giving birth to be called by that great sacred word? The last bright idea of family was disappearing in the girl's soul. She was at liberty, but she had neither work nor lodging, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. Stephen, the last time they had seen each other was a long time ago. It was early February, a whole 3 years ago. Back then, their relationship had come to a head and ended without announcement because Marian had gone to juvie. He was relatively young, good-looking, and successful. "I don't stand a chance," thought Marian as she sat in her room, listening to the occasional scandalous yelling coming from the next room. It was late in the evening. Without deciding anything, she went to bed. In the morning, having filtered all her thoughts and considerations overnight, Marian decided to go to Stephen's. She wasn't counting on anything, just financial help. He had helped her with her lawyer after all, and you could say, albeit indirectly, he had been involved in her parole. Perhaps he would give her some money for the first time, and that was fine with the ex-convict, who was practically at the bottom of her life. She wrote him a short message. "It's Varia. I'm free. You don't be afraid of me. I'm still the same. Tomorrow I'll be outside the shop at the Forest Cafe at 8. Marian was waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee. He was on time. He didn't have to wait a minute. From even farther away he smiled and pronounced, "Well, here we meet at last." Marian didn't hear anything, but smiled too and waved at him. "Yes, I see you, hello." The man hugged his acquaintance warmly and sat down opposite. "How are you?" asked Marian. "Yes, better than anyone else. I went even higher." "Wow, and what are you now?" "Yeah, I'm a regional manager. We don't just have New York locations anymore. We have Chicago, Florida, and Washington, D.C. now. So they're all over the place. Luckily, I was here yesterday and I'm here today. I'll be somewhere else tomorrow." "Wow." Marian was surprised. "You're doing great." "Just a little." Stephen smiled satisfactorily, full of pride. "I congratulate you on this event." "Thanks, but what about you?" "Got a place to live? Got a job?" "Well, it's hard right now. I couldn't even get a job at a grocery store." "I don't know, I'll keep looking." "And housing?" "I've been living in a flat for the last week." She sighed heavily and sadly. "What's wrong, Marian?" Stephen asked gently. "I don't want to be a beggar, but I'm in a bad situation." "Come on, Marian, we always help our own. I'll put 1,100 on your card for the first time. If you have any problems, just ask." Marian was glad that at least someone on this earth was not indifferent to her difficult situation. She had become accustomed to hardship, not wanting to live at the expense of others, and the money Stephen had given her she saw simply as salvation. No longer did she want to use it. Sitting in a cafe, she saw the ring on his finger and realized he was married. Stephen probably had children by now as well. He was a little different from his old self. He didn't have that lightness, and he spoke to her in a polite, decent way, leaving no hint at the end of the evening of any further development of the relationship. He was also a stranger to her, and yet she was grateful to him for another rescue. Standing on the balcony of her new accommodation, which she had paid for 2 months in advance, now feeling relatively stable, Marian smoked and enjoyed the cool late April day. She was determined. I'll look for a job and I'll find one, but people. Who do I need? Self has me. She raised her head high, closed her eyes, and through the small slit of her thin lips, slowly the thick cigarette smoke seeped out. The summer came. Marian found a job. She was hired at a beauty parlor, cleaning the premises. She didn't just scrub the floors. The girl watched the work of masters who painted the visitors' nails, cut hair, corrected eyebrows, and applied eyelashes. In the future, Marian wanted to learn one of these professions, but to do this, it was necessary to earn money for the courses. When she had the first money, she immediately went to a needlework shop and bought a lot of beads. In the evenings, tired from scrubbing the parlor floors, Marian strung the little balls on thread, remembering her days in the colony. Strange thoughts crossed her mind. She missed those days, for in that life there were people like herself with whom she could have a heart-to-heart talk, and they wouldn't look at you as an outsider, no matter what you told them about your plight. One fine day, and it was fine, because it was a Saturday, Marian received a call from a stranger. Here we go, another divorce. Who else could it be, she thought sadly. Still, Marian answered the call. Hello, I'm listening. There was silence. Marian was about to press the red button, but then she heard a man's voice. Is this Marian? Yes, Marian, who is this? Marian, don't hang up right away. It's the man on the other end of the line was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking. Tell me, who are you? Marian asked in bewilderment. I'm your dad. I have a lot to say, but don't hang up. I'm not hanging up. Calm down. Which dad is it, Marcus? No, this is your real daddy. My name is Sebastian. I was in contact with your mom, Kimberly, about 30 years ago. I'm asking you not to reject me right away. You're not living well. You need alimony. You'd better be honest with me, Marian replied resentfully, thinking that this man wanted only profit from her. We are like that, replied the man cheerfully. Well, I'm for honesty. No one needs me in this life, Papa, and I have no money, and I have no home. I have nothing and nobody. Yes, I know, but I have everything, but I have no one to share it with. You're the only one I've got. Well, will you come visit me in Florida? Where? Marian asked me. I live in Florida. I have my own business here. I know your mom a little bit. So I told her, like you, that I have nothing. I'm starving. I need help. She told me about you too. She said let her provide for you, but I knew you were my daughter. Anyway, it's not a phone conversation. I'll send you my address. Come and talk to me. Marian hung up the phone. She realized that everything in her life very soon and very abruptly changed. Not resenting fate, not expecting anything good from it, and yet not being angry at the world. Through suffering, pain, betrayals, and hardships, she finally waited for her bright streak. Mary stood by the side of the highway and shivered. October was getting colder. She should get a warmer jacket from the pantry. Grandma Veronica had warned her granddaughter yesterday, don't be lazy, prepare tomorrow's clothes, according to the weather. But Mary had no time. She finished her homework, then watched a TV series, then with her friends in the yard on the bench chatted until late in the evening. And then it's time to go to bed. Nothing. Tomorrow is Saturday. She will have time to find a warm jacket and clean it, if necessary. The girl didn't like that down jacket. She'd inherited it from her neighbor's daughter, Kristen. She was a grown woman, studying in the city, at university. And the jacket Kristen had worn when she was Mary's age was in good condition, of course, but not fashionable at all. But there was no choice here. Grandma Veronica didn't have that much money to buy her granddaughter fancy new clothes every season. Mary understood this very well. That's why she was never capricious, unlike most of her classmates. Her grandmother tried very hard to make sure that their small family did not need anything. And Mary also tried because she was not a little girl 12 years old, after all. And now, after school, Mary was selling dairy products on the road leading to the city. There was a private farm in the village called Sullivan's. They had goats and cows. They had a whole farmyard full of animals. They took most of their produce to the city, to the market, but there was always a surplus cottage cheese, milk, sour cream. That's what Mary sold after school for Uncle Sullivan. He even built a special counter and a cart himself. He's got good hands, of course. Mary used that cart every day after school to take the milk to the road. An hour or two and it was sold like hotcakes. Mary had her own regular customers here. Then Mary would return the empty cart to the Sullivans and give them the proceeds. And when they paid her in money, they paid her a percentage of the proceeds when they paid her in natural products. Aunt Tammy also took the young worker out to lunch every time. She almost always refused. She was uncomfortable, even though the neighbor sincerely wanted to treat the girl. Grandmother Veronica received a tiny pension and worked part-time as a cleaner at the local clinic. Every morning and every evening she went to the other end of the village to the old two-story building and washed the floors. In the afternoon she did the housework, cleaning, cooking. Mary helped her, of course. But Grandma Veronica usually sent her granddaughter to her room to do her homework. Go better do your math, you'll have time to wave a rag. You'll work hard in life. Right now you're focused on your studies. Mary knew that it was very important for Grandma Veronica that her granddaughter did well in school, made friends with children from decent families, and got an education. The grandmother was very afraid that the girl would repeat the fate of her parents. She loved Mary and dreamed of a better future for her. And not just dreamed, but did a lot for this. For example, bought Mary books. The girl learned to read early, and by the time she was 8 or 9 years old, she had read all the children's books from the meager local library. And then Grandmother Veronica began to buy Mary books in the city on her small pension. Read, my clever girl. You'll learn, you'll get into people, you'll become a respected and important person. And Grandma Veronica often talked to Mary's teachers about the girl's academic performance. She kept a close eye on it, but here everything was just fine. The girl was one of the best students in the class. And no wonder, because Grandmother Veronica so much engaged with her granddaughter before school, and letters she taught her to write, and numbers to add up. And in general, a lot of interesting and important things about the world told. Mary grew up with her grandmother, who was not even her relative according to the documents. In the village, where everyone knew each other, there were no problems with this. Mary's story was common knowledge. Grandma Veronica's son Stephen was a tomboy from childhood. He didn't like to study, nor did he want to. He didn't listen to his mother, and he had no father. Grandma Veronica's husband died when the son was only 2 years old. A heart attack. Unexpected, like a thunderbolt. So the young woman was left a widow with a small child in her arms. She had to carry everything on herself: the house, her son, and her work. Baba Veronica worked as a milkmaid in several shifts at once. How else to feed herself and the child? Stephen grew on his own, like a weed. The woman realized that she should pay more attention to her son, but there was no opportunity. By the time you come back from the evening milking, it's late. And then there's cooking, laundry, and homework to check. Stephen, I must say, has always been a sociable guy. His friends came first. He liked to go out, play with kids, spend time outside the house. At first, his mother was pleased with the easy character of her son. Well, yes, not an angel, of course, but he is a guy. That's normal. But he's so nice to talk to. He's got friends in half the village. When he grows up, he'll be a support for his mother. He'll slowly take over the men's work. But time passed. Stephen grew up. But he wasn't going to help his parents. He still had on his mind only partying with friends, the same knuckleheads like himself. At school, the boy began to skip school, lessons completely abandoned. Once the teachers even wanted to leave the guy for a second year. The mother intervened, begging to give her son a chance to correct. It's such a shame. 2 years in the same class. Veronica begged her son for help. Then she even demanded that he take over the household chores. It was hard for her to carry everything alone, but he always found excuses or just let his mother's words pass his ears. He was tempted by the will, partying, freedom. He came home only late in the evening to sleep and eat. Veronica was in despair. She realized that her son was getting out of hand, but there was nothing she could do about it. "What can you do?" sighed her friends, to whom the woman complained about her situation. "The boy grows up without a father's strictness, without a male example. You, Veronica, have no father, no brother, no one to keep Stephen in check. Well, the army will fix him." After the army, everyone's brains get back in place. Veronica hoped the army would be a miracle. And indeed, home after the service came a completely different Stephen, matured, serious and full of life plans. "I decided to go to the city, to the construction college," he announced his decision to his mother. Veronica rejoiced. Previously, her offspring did not talk about the future at all, living one day at a time. Now he was thinking about studying. "I'll need money for the first time," he added, "until I find a job. They give me a dormitory, but I need something to travel on, something to eat." Of course. Veronica splashed her hands. "What are we talking about?" The woman had some savings. Stephen knew about them. Veronica was saving from her paycheck for a rainy day. You never know. Well, if that was the case, if Stephen decided to study to get on his feet, no money could be spared for that. Veronica was flying on wings back then. Well, look at that. A son getting smart. Stephen got into school and happily informed his mother about it over the phone. He started living on his own in the city. Every month he faithfully showed up for money and told his parents how well he was doing now his studies were going well, and he liked it, and the guys were good. Sometimes, however, he asked for a bigger sum he needed to buy textbooks or repair something in the dormitory. Veronica gave everything, not regretting anything. Then she saved money, sat on bread and water for weeks before the paycheck, just so that her son would be well. After a while, Veronica began to notice that after Stephen's arrival, things disappeared from the house, her only gold earrings, almost new electric kettle, grandmother's ring. Veronica at first blamed it on the neighbors, then thought that she herself put these items somewhere and forgot about them. But then everything fell into place. Veronica began to hear rumors. The child of one of the neighbors entered her son's construction technical school, and it turned out right away that Stephen didn't go there. "You go check everything yourself," advised Veronica this neighbor. "Maybe your son was expelled, but expelled for truancy or failing grades, and he keeps telling you fairy tales." What? A student. So Veronica went. At first she thought she'd give up, because the story she'd painted seemed too unrealistic. Stephen couldn't lie to her, looking her straight in the eye. But doubts crept into the woman's head. So she went. At the dean's office, the truth came out. Turns out Stephen wasn't expelled. It turns out he never even went to this technical school. I mean, he'd been lying to his mom from the beginning. That's probably when the woman realized that all her efforts were for nothing. Her son would never turn out to be a good man. Stephen's a liar, a lazy man. Of course, he's the one who made things disappear from the house. He needs the money. Veronica cried all night that night. Resentment, bitterness, disappointment, it all came down on her like a heavy burden. How many plans, how many hopes were connected with her son? And now what? Was it all for nothing? And hard work, and sleepless nights, and excitement, and anxiety for the child? Or maybe it was her own fault for what had happened to Stephen? Of course she did. After all, in an attempt to earn a penny, Veronica did not pay attention to her son at all, did not check his homework, did not inquire about what was happening in his life. Tiredness, endless fatigue, and lack of time, and no one around who could help with the upbringing of the boy. That's the result. And yet Veronica then managed to convince herself that everything could still be fine. She decided to have a serious conversation with Stephen. The woman determined for herself a line of behavior. She will not blame her son, will not call him a liar. Veronica would simply talk to him seriously and thoroughly. For the first time in a while, it wasn't an easy conversation. Stephen arrived, as usual, to pick up another load of money. He had a carefree smile on his face, but now Veronica saw what his son's eyes were like, insincere, prickly in some way. There was dislike or contempt in them. "I know everything, son," Veronica looked at her son. "About the technical school. Are you in trouble? Tell it like it is." At first, Stephen tried to deny it, but Veronica explained that she had already gone to the dean's office and found out everything. "All right," Stephen bowed his head. "Yes, Mom, you're right. I'm in trouble." It turned out that Stephen was not going to enter the technical school. He realized that he couldn't afford to study, And of course he would fail the entrance exams. He hadn't studied well at school, and miracles don't happen. He wanted to get a job in the city, where you can find sources of income even without education. So he found one. Got mixed up with a bad crowd. Guys were burglarizing dacha plots. They took appliances, furniture, clothes, dishes, anything they could sell, and then sell it at the flea market. When Veronica heard about it, she clutched her heart. Son, how could it be like this? Did I teach you that? It just happened. Stephen lowered his head below his shoulders. He looked so lost, so remorseful that Veronica felt very sorry for him. Money was needed. There were no other ways to earn it. And so, Stephen said he wanted to leave the gang, wanted to return to an honest life. But they wouldn't let him go. It's these people, Mom, they're threatening me, demanding a ransom for me to leave, a payoff. Otherwise, I'm finished. Why don't we go to the police? Veronica suggested. What she heard gave her the chills. How could it be? Stephen had always been a lazy bum, a slacker. But to do something like this. What police? Have you forgotten? I'm just like them? I'll go straight to jail. I don't want to. So what now? There's no way out. Why not? There is. I have to give them the money, like a ransom for me, and then they'll let me go. How much? And Stephen said a sum that made Veronica's eyes water. You see, Mom? It's almost impossible to get out. And I'm so eager to start a new life. Fate has already taught me a lesson. I'm different now. I want to live an honest life. I'll think about what I can do. Veronica nodded. And she thought for a long time, carefully weighed all the pros and cons. She went through different options. The woman was not given a loan for such an amount. Salary is small, age is already pre-retirement. So she had to sell the house, because Veronica had nothing else. Mom, how did you do it? Rejoiced Stephen, who showed up at his mother's house the following week. Veronica told him everything as it happened. Where will you live now? The boy got excited. I'm already renting a room at Emily's. She's moving to Hope with her son anyway. And I don't think anyone's going to buy it. You know the state of that house. So I rented it from her for next to nothing. I can afford it. Thank you. Stephen exhaled. I'll never forget that. I'll buy you a new house. I'll buy you a new house. And not in this neck of the woods, but in the city. We're going to have a life. Stephen disappeared with the money. Veronica realized that it was unlikely that her son's promise would come true, but she had no regrets. She didn't want anything. Only if her son got rid of his bad company and started a new life. That would be her greatest reward. Emily's house, where Veronica now lived, was a tiny wooden hut. One room, a small kitchen, outdoor facilities, creaky floors, shaky roof. But the stove was functioning properly. That's a big deal. Gradually, Veronica settled down in the house, made it cozy, hung new curtains, laid fresh tablecloths, threw out unnecessary junk. With the landlady's permission, of course. Stephen came rarely. Veronica didn't expect Stephen to pay her back. Most of the time he came to borrow money from his mother for living expenses. He seemed to be doing well in the city. He said he worked at a construction site, rented an apartment, and worked from morning till night. The salary was good, but sometimes it was delayed. In those cases, he'd come to his mother's house to scrape together some money. Stephen's life was clearly not easy. He looked thin, pale, eyes dark, troubled. They keep going back and forth. Did the mother believe what her son said about working in the city? Yes and no. He'd been deceived many times before. But on the other hand, Veronica really wanted it to be as Stephen said. It gave her peace of mind. Veronica herself continued to work, but she couldn't pull several shifts as before. Health was failing her. The labor of a milkmaid is not easy. She had enough to live on, and that was all right. Of course, it was worrying that old age was coming, and Veronica had no corner of her own. What if Emily's kids decided to sell the house? What then? Where would she go? Veronica couldn't afford to rent a decent place. It was a drag, but the woman decided to accept her fate as it was. She couldn't change anything. Her friends criticized her for selling the house and giving all the money to Stephen. She'd drunk it, skipped town, and now she was homeless. Veronica just shook her head. She'd look at her friends and neighbors if their children came to them with such a request. They'd probably sell everything too, just to save the child. Veronica didn't regret what she'd done. Stephen was disliked in the village, and therefore probably there were different rumors about him. Veronica realized that it could very well be true. Still, she preferred not to believe what people said. They said that Stephen was using different substances. They said he was sometimes seen in bad company. Veronica realized that Stephen now appeared very rarely. When he did show up, he really didn't look his best. But his son said he worked hard and slept little, and that was why he was so thin. And Veronica wanted to grasp these versions of his story like a drowning man grasping at straws. People lie. All they want to do is scratch their tongues. One day near evening, Stephen knocked on the kitchen window. It was late fall, windy, cold, raining. As usual, the son showed up unannounced. But this time the boy wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a woman, thin, with a short haircut, a predatory look and a smirk on her lips. There was something repulsive about her. But Veronica, of course, did not show her attitude toward the strange visitor. "This is Gabrielle," Stephen introduced his companion. "My girlfriend." Veronica smiled at Gabrielle, thinking to herself that she wasn't a girl at all. The lady looked to be in her mid-40s. Her figure was almost girlish thin, and there were deep wrinkles under her eyes and around her mouth. It was obvious that she drank and smoked, not the kind of bride Veronica had dreamed of for her son. So what now? As it turns out, everything in life doesn't go according to plan. The main thing was that they were happy together. Veronica invited the guests to the table. She had a pie cooking in the oven. The woman was going to invite her friends to tea. But since it's like this, "We're going to live here now with you," Stephen announced. Veronica almost choked on her pie. Well, that's news. It turned out that the couple had rented an apartment in the city. But Stephen had lost his job, and Gabrielle didn't work at all. She was laid off a long time ago, and now they don't hire her anywhere, because soon the woman will go on maternity leave. Who would want a woman like that? "You see, Mom, it's a desperate situation," Stephen ranted. "We've got a baby on the way, and we've got nowhere to live, no money. You can't kick us out." "No, of course not," Veronica shook her head. It was a thought she had yet to get used to. Veronica had lived alone in the small house for so long, and the loneliness didn't weigh her down yet. There wasn't enough room for so many people. On the other hand, where would they go? These adults who had never settled down, especially if they had a baby on the way. And Veronica started a whole new life. She didn't particularly like it, but what could she do? A son is a son. She raised him herself. Stephen didn't even think about getting a job. Neither did Gabriel. Both of them sat quietly on the neck of the elderly Veronica, as if it was the right thing to do. The woman rightly hoped at least to help with the household chores. But it was no use. Gabriel and Stephen quickly found friends in the village, the same pro-lifers as themselves. And so it began partying until morning at their new friend's house, then sleeping until dinner, watching TV, and then all over again. Gabrielle was at ease and relaxed with Veronica. She was not at all embarrassed that she lived in someone else's house and at someone else's expense. This simple manner of communication even somewhat impressed Veronica. Holy simplicity, that's what they called it. Gabrielle had a complicated fate. She grew up in an orphanage, did not know her family. From an apartment from the state, she, then a very young graduate, was cheated. Veronica decided she could re-educate Gabrielle, and Stephen's brains would surely fall into place after the baby was born. Except it didn't work out. Mary was born prematurely. Not surprising, given her mother's lifestyle. At first, they didn't want Gabrielle to have the baby at all. The woman was taken by ambulance from the front porch of a convenience store already drugged. But Veronica turned to a neighbor. His son was on the police force, and the little girl was still given to irresponsible parents, under the control and responsibility of a vigilant grandmother. Veronica hoped that the baby's arrival would change things, but it didn't. Gabrielle had no intention of taking care of her newborn daughter. Immediately after the maternity ward, she plunged into her old life with Stephen. Veronica had struggled to get the grief-stricken parents to draw up the paperwork for Mary. She completely took care of the child, but something responsible grandmother to do still could not for the registration of documents, attachment to the polyclinic. To solve many other issues needed the official representatives of the girl, that is, the parents. Or rather the mother, because the relationship between Gabrielle and Stephen was not formalized, and legally Mary had only her mother. Officially, the grandmother, the only person who cared for the child, was considered a stranger to Mary. It was a bit of a struggle to get the paperwork done. And then Stephen and Gabriel just disappeared one day, leaving the baby in the care of her loving grandmother. To be honest, Veronica breathed a sigh of relief. She had become attached to the little girl from the first days. Of course, it was hard to take care of an infant at such an advanced age. But it's even worse when there are two adults living in the house, leading a dissolute lifestyle. With Stephen and Gabriel gone, things had only gotten better. Veronica was glad that her parents didn't take their daughter with them. The girl simply wouldn't have survived with them. Veronica's heart clenched at the thought of what would happen to the little girl if she suddenly found herself alone with her grief-stricken ancestors. What a cute baby, admired the neighbors, while a happy Veronica rolled the stroller with sleeping Mary down the driveway. When Stephen was a baby, the woman had no time to take care of him. Now that she was a grandmother, she was going through this phase all over again. Only now she had a little girl, charming, fragile, touching, with incredibly long eyelashes and soft curls. Yes, a miracle, agreed Veronica. With those closest to her, she shared her fears. I'm afraid Gabriel will take it away. And yet, why would she need it? Her friends wondered. This is not the kind of person to suddenly arouse love for a child. She doesn't need a girl. And the allowance? Do you get an allowance for your granddaughter yourself? No, Gabrielle gets it all on her card. Well, then calm down, she has money, no worries. Veronica knew the neighbors were right. She even tried to do everything according to the law, appealed to the guardianship authorities. But the niece of one of Veronica's fellow villagers worked in the guardianship. She explained the situation to the woman in a friendly manner. You see, the girl will not be given to her parents, of course, but they will not return her to you either. They'll send her to an orphanage. And why? Veronica gasped. I'm her grandmother according to the documents. You're a stranger to her. And in general, you have no conditions for a child. A rented old house, low income, age. No one will give you the baby. So what do? You just live your life as it is. Gabrielle, ask Gabrielle to give you your allowance card in good faith. You're actually raising a child, that's the only way. Only by agreement. But Veronica didn't go to Gabrielle. Of course, no one would give her the card. But the baby. The mother could take the baby. There's no telling. Maybe she'd even get the idea to sell the girl to someone. That's what they do. They'll do anything for money. And so Mary stayed at Veronica's house on a bird's license. Gabriel and Stephen made occasional visits to the village. They came to see their daughter. They smiled at the girl, but shunned her. For her, they were strangers, strange people whom her grandmother was clearly afraid of. Stephen once again borrowed money from his mother, and the sweet couple went away. One day the police knocked on Veronica's door, not local, from the city. They said Stephen was dead. The substances he'd been using had taken his health and then his life. Mary was about 6 years old at the time. Only the need to care for her granddaughter kept Veronica from drowning in black grief. Yes, Stephen's lifestyle was wrong and very dangerous, but his mother hoped, sincerely believed that sooner or later he would take up his mind, become different for the sake of his daughter. Veronica saw that Mary Gabriel wasn't interested at all. Well, that's good. It was better for the little girl to stay with her grandmother than to live with such a mother or in an orphanage. Life went on as usual. Veronica retired and began to work part-time as a cleaner. She practiced a lot with her granddaughter, trying not to make the same mistakes she had made with her son. Mary grew up quite different, not like Stephen, attentive, affectionate, hardworking. She tried to help her grandmother in everything, which especially touched Veronica's heart. No one had taken such care of her for a long time. Mary studied well, obeyed her grandmother in everything. And then she found a part-time job selling milk at the Savliev's on the road. At first, Veronica was worried who knows who drives there on the road frightened the girl or worse. But then she calmed down. Mary was a smart and clever girl, mature beyond her years. She had a good sense of people and knew how to behave with strangers, and the money the girl earned was not at all superfluous. Mary knew her story. Veronica had told her granddaughter about it 4 years ago. The girl naturally asked questions about her parents. Veronica did not consider it necessary to invent beautiful fairy tales. All the same, someone from the village sooner or later will open her eyes to the truth. There was no hiding the truth. It was better to tell Mary about Stephen and Gabrielle herself, choosing her words carefully so as not to traumatize the child. The granddaughter was not particularly upset, because the girl did not know these people before. So what did she have to worry about? True, Mary would certainly be interested to know more about Gabrielle, for her mother was still alive. Mary knew that Gabrielle was somewhere in town. Sometimes they even heard from mutual acquaintances Gabrielle had a new boyfriend, or she was in the hospital again. Veronica prayed to God that Gabrielle would live to see Mary come of age. After all, if something happened to her, the guardianship authorities would then be obliged to find her daughter and place the child in an orphanage. In the meantime, so far, so good. Mary never told Baba Vera about it, so as not to upset her. But she often thought about her mother and father. She fantasized about how her fate would have been if they'd been ordinary people. And now, too, a beautiful car was speeding down the highway. Mary could see a family in it, a middle-aged man at the wheel, a woman next to him, probably his wife, and a girl about her age in the back. All three were laughing and talking almost simultaneously. They were probably discussing something pleasant. Mary smiled as she escorted the car with a glance. Happy. I wish she could be like that. It's all right. Grandma's life is not bad either. When Mary grows up, she will buy a nice house in the city, where she and her grandmother will live together. But she'll have to study first, get a good job. A house. This word has recently become somehow alarming, because recently something happened that was so afraid of Grandma Vera. The owner of the house where Grandma and Mary lived had died, and her children wished to sell the old house. A buyer for such a wreck will not be found quickly, but they have already advertised. So sooner or later, she and Grandma are going to have to move out. But where to? Grandma Vera is very worried about it. She tries not to show it in front of her granddaughter, but Mary notices not a little girl. Recently, the girl heard a conversation between her grandmother and a neighbor. I feel that we will soon go to the world with Mary. Money is not enough to rent a normal room is not enough. I don't know what to do. Beg her Gabrielle and she demands to share her pension. Veronica was very worried about the housing situation. She realized that their modest income would not be enough to rent a normal room. Veronica could not demand money from Gabrielle, fearing that she would take Mary for herself, and the girl would end up in terrible conditions or worse in an orphanage. Mary saw how hard it was for her grandmother, and her heart shrank with pity for the only native person. But how could the girl help in such a situation? Probably the only possible support from her not to create unnecessary problems and earn a little at least for bread and milk. Mary had sold off almost all her goods. There was only 1.5-liter bottle of milk and a jar of sour cream left. Just a little more and we could go back. That was good, because Mary was already freezing in the fresh October wind in her light raincoat. In spite of the cold, Mary sincerely admired the scenery. Behind her was a wide field crossed by a dusty country road. The grass had already withered a little. But not so long ago the steppe was blooming with bright multicolored flowers. But even now it is beautiful here. And on the other side of the highway stretches a forest. The bushes and trees are beautiful now. If Mary knew how to draw, she would have put this beauty on paper. What colors: gold, purple, bright yellow leaves. All mixed together. The eye is delighted. Suddenly the girl's attention was attracted by something strange, some movement on the other side of the highway. It was as if the bushes on the left side were moving. Mary looked closely. Was it just a vision? No. On the other side of the road there was a rustle, and the bushes moved again. The girl froze. It wasn't that she was frightened, but it sounded like someone big in the bushes. Mary cautiously approached the old woman. She was clearly distraught and mumbled something inaudible to her son. She seemed to be delirious, perhaps because of hypothermia or some disease. The girl squatted down next to the old woman and softly called out to her grandmother, "Can you hear me? What happened to you?" But the old woman did not react in any way. continuing to mumble and stare somewhere in the void with glazed eyes. Mary realized she couldn't do it alone. She had to call for help. She jumped to her feet and ran back to the road. Her heart was pounding frantically from fear and from running fast. When she reached the roadside, Mary stopped, trying to catch her breath and frantically thinking about what to do next. It would take a long time to get to the village, and it would take a long time to find one of the adults. And the old woman needs help right now. Suddenly, she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A car was coming down the road. Mary waved her arms, trying to get the driver's attention. The car started to slow down. "Please help me. There's a grandmother lying in the bushes. She's sick." Mary, who was out of breath, shouted as she ran toward the stopped car. A middle-aged man got out of the car. After listening to the girl's confused story, he nodded and pulled out his cell phone. "Okay, I see. Now I'll call an ambulance. And you run to your grandmother. See that it doesn't get worse. I'll be right there." Mary exhaled a sigh of relief, thanked the man, and ran back to the old lady. Now at least she wasn't alone in this frightening situation. Help was on the way. Mary shuddered at the old woman's words. It seemed that this grandmother wanted to harm her own son. His name is Leonid. Or maybe it's all a delusion. The old lady's in a terrible state. But what if it's not a delusion? What if this same Leonid right now is watching them from deep in the woods and understands perfectly well that now the girl knows too much? Mary had goosebumps running down her spine. She looked around. It seemed quiet. We must act. The old woman needs help. The girl didn't see any injuries on her body, but there's no telling what her own son had done to her. Maybe he poisoned her? Mary herself cannot help her grandmother. She cannot even lift her. So we must run to the village and call the grown-ups. They'll sort it out for sure. Leaving the tray of unsold goods on the road, Mary ran as fast as she could into the village. She had never run so fast before. The wind whistled in her ears, her hair fluttered behind her back. Soon the girl felt hot. Wasn't it only a short time ago that she was shivering on the road? Already near the village, she met her neighbors, Uncle Peter and Uncle Stanley. The girl, panting, told them everything. "Show me where." Uncle Peter commanded. Mary nodded and ran in another direction. The men followed her. Aunt Angie, Uncle Stanley's wife, heard their dialogue. She immediately rushed into the village. Mary knew that now everyone would know about her terrible discovery. And that's a good thing. The grown-ups would figure out what to do. The responsibility that had weighed heavily on the girl's fragile shoulders seemed to evaporate. The adults were now in charge. On the way, Mary suddenly wondered if she had dreamed it all. The old woman in the bushes, her blue handkerchief, her eyes staring into the distance. But no, the grandmother was still lying in the bushes, only she was no longer talking. Mary was even afraid at first that she was too late for help. She became very frightened. "She's alive," Uncle Peter exclaimed, gently lifting the old woman off the ground. "How did she get here?" Puzzled Uncle Stanley, "It doesn't look as if she'd gone mushrooming." "There's no basket, and it's not a mushrooming place," said one of the crowd. The other villagers came up. Aunt Angie did her job and got everyone on their feet. Among the crowd, Mary saw Grandma Vera. Seeing a loved one, the girl was relieved. "We need an ambulance," exclaimed one of the women. "By the time they reach us, so much time will pass," said Grandma Vera. "The man will freeze. Peter, take her to our house, or Grandma will catch cold in the wind. We'll wait for the doctors there." "I've already called an ambulance," said Uncle Stanley. "But the police too, just in case." The old woman was brought to the house where Grandma Vera and Mary lived. They laid her on the bed and covered her with a blanket. Mary watched carefully the old woman, who now seemed to be asleep. She waited to see if she would say something again. But the old woman was silent. The women crowded into the room and speculated about the old woman's fate. Maybe she had gone for mushrooms? Lost her way? She wandered and wandered through the woods, but she got on the road, said one. No, objected another. That can't be true. Such a thing would definitely be on the news, that a man was missing. And here is silence. I think she's not herself. You know, she's out of her mind from old age, so she left. She's a lonely grandmother, so they haven't missed her yet. Mary remembered the words the old woman had said in the heat of forgetfulness. The old woman lamented that her son Leo wanted to get rid of her, but in front of the neighbors the girl did not voice this monologue. First of all, it is not very likely, suddenly seemed to her. The old woman spoke very quietly, barely audible. Secondly, for some reason Mary did not want this fact to go around the village. The local gossips liked to exaggerate and embellish things. No, Mary would tell her grandmother when they were alone. In the meantime. For now, it's best to keep quiet. The police were the first to arrive. They took Mary's statement, asked how the girl came across the old woman. What did she do afterwards? It's good that the uniformed men didn't specify directly whether this grandmother said something or not. Mary couldn't lie to the face of the law. And the locals were eager to catch every word she said so they could pass it on. Then the doctors showed up. Mary breathed a sigh of relief when she saw a white car pull up to their gate. Now she would be helped. They loaded the old woman on a stretcher and carried her to the car. Baba Vera, on realizing this, jumped out after them. From the window, Mary could see her talking to the men in white coats. "They're taking her to Springfield," Vera explained when she returned to the house. "We should visit her afterward." You don't know what it's like if a person has no one. How does it feel when no one visits you in the hospital? When everyone had gone, Mary told Baba Vera what she'd heard from the old woman. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Grandmother aghast. "I don't know," she shrugged her shoulders. "I thought, if the old woman didn't want it. Or was she just having some kind of a delusion?" "That's right, too," agreed Grandma Vera. "You're a good girl, you're growing up. You're not a gossip, you don't talk for nothing. You think 100 times, then you speak." Mary smiled at her grandmother. "Is she going to be all right?" "I don't know. I've been trying to ask the doctors, but they've been getting away with it. Let's hope so. We did the best we could." "It's a good thing I saw the bushes moving," Mary said, and shrugged her shoulders shakily. She imagined what would have happened to the old woman if the girl had not been on the road at the right time. A week passed. During this time, they found out the identity of the old woman. It turned out that this is a resident of the village, which is located at a distance of about 50 kilometers from the place where Mary found her grandmother. The locals unanimously assured that she lives alone, although she has an adult son. He seemed to live in the city and rarely appeared at his mother's house. The old woman had given up lately. She almost never got out of bed. She could hardly move around the house. And now suddenly she was in the woods and so far from her home. Mary watched with curiosity as Grandma Vera was going somewhere. "Where are you going, Grandma?" asked the girl. "The hospital called me. I gave my phone number to the Felger and asked him to let me know when it would be possible to visit the old woman." "And what? She came to her senses?" Mary exclaimed with joy. All this time she had been very worried about that grandmother. She felt sorry for her. "She came to her senses a long time ago, but the visit was allowed only now," smiled Grandma Vera. "I'll go and visit her. I baked her some pies. The neighbors say that she is a lonely grandmother. It will probably be pleasant to her, such attention." "I'm coming with you," Mary said with confidence. "I want to talk to her too. Is that convenient?" Grandma Vera was confused. "I don't know if it's necessary. After all, I'm the one who found her." "All right, what's the matter now?" "Get ready then. The bus will be here in 15 minutes. Mary thought it would be just like the movie she liked to watch. She and her grandmother would go up to the whitewashed room where the rescued old woman would be lying on a bed, all wrapped in wires. But no. The strict receptionist from the waiting room told the visitors to wait for the patient downstairs on a leather couch. There were already a lot of people here, patients in gowns, pajamas, and slippers, and their relatives and friends who came to check on their own. Soon the old woman appeared. Mary was the first to see her and recognized her immediately. Her grandmother looked much better now, still thin, but her face was no longer that frightening dead pallor, and her light green eyes looked quite conscious and very friendly. "How do you do?" said Baba Vera, waving her hand. Now she too noticed the old woman. The patient smiled and moved towards the visitors. It was only then that Mary realized that the grandmother didn't know who had come to see her. They had seen her that October day, but she wasn't in the right state to remember their faces. "Hello," smiled the old woman, coming closer. A kind, warm smile, good, calm. "So it was you who saved me then?" "My granddaughter, Mary," answered Grandma Vera. "Thank you, girl. I don't know what would have happened to me if it hadn't been for your attentiveness. Of course I do. But I don't want to think about it, no matter what." Then they all got to know each other. Turns out the old lady's name is Poppy Parson. She lives in the next village, quite a long way from where Mary found her. "How on earth did you get here?" wondered Grandma Vera. She looked very young compared to Poppy Parson. There must have been 10 or 12 years difference between them. "It's a sad story," sighed Poppy Parson. "I've been ill, I've been sick. I got weak. I thought it was the end of me. But I don't know. It was like my mind went blank. Something came over me. I gathered up my last strength and went wherever I was going, without any purpose. It was like someone was calling me from the woods. Temporary insanity. So I must have reached you somehow, and then I collapsed from exhaustion. And Mary found me." Baba Vera shook her head sadly. For some reason, Mary did not believe this part of Poppy Parson's story. It seemed to her that the old woman was hiding something from them. Otherwise, the new acquaintance was quite sincere and pleasant to talk to. Mary could see that she and Vera had found a common language. A couple of minutes later, the women were already discussing a variety of topics: health, news, weather. And they couldn't get enough of talking, like old friends. They also had a common misfortune: their wayward sons. Poppy Parson's son was outwardly a prosperous man. He studied, married, settled in the city. But his mother's life hadn't interested him since. He became like a complete stranger to the one who had raised him and put him on his feet. Baba Vera was so moved by this story that she even cried. Poppy Parson couldn't hold back her tears either. She could see that the situation with her son was causing her real heartache. Mary looked at the grandmothers talking to each other and thought about whether or not to ask Poppy Parson about what she had mumbled while lying in the bushes. It was awkward to touch the subject. And Grandma Vera, as if she had forgotten what her granddaughter had told her. She didn't ask anything either. Or maybe she really forgot, didn't care. "Oh, poor Poppy," sighed Grandma Vera on the way back. "She raised her son alone, just like me, stretched, tried, did so much for him, and he left her alone, and he lives happily in the city. He's got a wife there, a family. He's forgotten his mother. He doesn't care that she's sick. She's been lying around the house for so long, barely able to walk. Neighbors ran to the store for her, but not her son. What a fate. I guess we're a bit like Poppy, me and her. Why didn't you ask her? I told you about what she was mumbling in the bushes. About Leo's son. Like he was the one who was trying to ruin her. And anyway," sighed Grandma Vera, looking at her granddaughter. "She seems to be a smart girl, but sometimes she just blabs. Do you think she would be pleased to hear that? Especially since Poppy told her how she got into the woods. Her son had nothing to do with it. And the fact that it's him. I think that's what she really thought in her delirium. And there's some truth to what she said. Of course, Leo almost ruined his mother with his indifference, betrayal, oblivion. Good, at least the doctors pulled her out, cured her. As they say, there is no good without good. If Poppy had not been in the hospital, so slowly and would have died at home, alone. And now she's been treated for her heart condition. And now she'll live another 100 years on the new pills." Mary shook her head. Still, something in this story bothered her very much. Baba Vera and Mary visited Poppy a few more times. The old ladies had become very friendly. It was good that things had worked out that way. One day, said Poppy, "It was worth being lost in the woods to meet good people like you." "We'll be friends now," smiled Grandma Vera. "We won't get away from each other now." And such a light atmosphere arose around the three of them. Such a trusting atmosphere, that Mary finally made up her mind. "Baba Poppy," said the girl. As it happened, that was what she had begun to call Poppy. "Can I ask you something?" Baba Vera looked at her granddaughter warningly, but she decided that she would go through with it. "Of course you can," dear Poppy smiled at her. "There in the bushes, when I found you, for some reason you said that your son Leo, that he decided to send you to the other world. I thought he'd done something to you and left you in the woods. What a restless little brat," exclaimed Grandma Vera angrily. "Forgive her, her tongue is boneless, and her imagination is irrepressible, always thinking of something. But she's right." Poppy shook her head. Her eyes suddenly became so sad that Mary immediately regretted having asked her question. She had to know the truth, though. After all, if Leah was really guilty of something, then Poppy was still in danger, and Mary cared about her fate. The girl was worried about her and her grandmother's new acquaintance. "What do you mean?" "She's right." Grandma Vera didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "It's true, friend," Poppy decided. "I'll tell you my story." I'm ashamed, of course, to confess such things. In my delirium, I told the truth. Leo, my only son, really wanted to send me to the afterlife. It's a hard thing to realize. I didn't fully believe it, but everything says it's true. It's unfortunate. Poppy raised her son alone. In that, she was a lot like Grandma Vera. But the reasons why the women's sons were left fatherless were different. Baba Vera's husband died of a heart attack. But with Poppy's husband, Andrew, it was a different story. Young Poppy met her future husband by chance at the harvest. They sent them then in the village help young people from the city. Among them, and Andrew was cheerful, humorous, the soul of the company. He amused the whole brigade with his jokes. He didn't work too fast himself. It's understandable, a city dweller not used to the land. But he cheered everyone up. Andrew was everyone's favorite at first. He was funny, a good-natured joker. And a good-looking one, too. Bright blue eyes, hair the color of ripe wheat. A wide, open smile. Poppy was being courted by a former classmate of hers, Jerry. He was a nice guy, quiet and thorough. And she seemed to like him in every way. You couldn't go wrong with a guy like that. With such a family, life will be nourished and measured, right? But against Andrew's background, Jerry suddenly seemed to Poppy somehow small, simple. With the arrival of a cheerful city boy in the village, Poppy's eyes were fixed only on him. And not just her eyes. To the great annoyance of young Poppy, there were girls around Andrew, both local and visiting, making eyes at him, trying to talk to the handsome guy. He didn't say no to anyone. He tried to pay attention to everyone. This caused unpleasant feelings in Poppy's soul, something like jealousy. The girl self-corrected for incomprehensible feelings. Well, what does she expect at all? He is not for her a bird, not her flight. He is so handsome, so modern, so fashionable, as if a guy from the movies. And she's a country shepherdess who gets lost in his presence. No eyebrows as black as felt boots, no statuesque figure, no mop of hair down to her waist, nothing to look at. Why would Andrew want her when he could have anyone? But Andrew chose her. It came as a complete surprise to Poppy. At that moment, the guy approached her at the disco, which was organized in the local club on the occasion of the end of the harvest. Andrew invited Poppy to dance and said words that made the girl dizzy. She had never heard such exquisite compliments, especially to herself. Andrew knew how to choose beautiful words, and his gaze, directed at Poppy, reflected sincere admiration. Much later, Poppy realized why Andrew had taken notice of her. He was a charming catcher with charisma, who had nothing to do in the city he did not want to work, but needed a roof over his head. Rumors of orphan Poppy, living alone and in need of support, reached Andrew the perfect chance for him. To settle in the village and win the heart of a naive girl, he was not difficult. So they began to live together, the city's handsome man and Poppy, who was in love with him. The wedding was held modestly in the spring. The young people had no money for a party. Poppy worked as a librarian for a small salary, and Andrew worked at odd jobs. Although trained as a painter, he allegedly could not get a job in his specialty. If he could earn money, he spent it on entertainment, pulling his friends into his feasts. Jerry, Poppy's former lover, had a hard time with their separation, but Poppy's heart belonged to Andrew from the day he appeared in the village. Andrew was never able to get used to life in the village house. Andrew had spent his whole life in the city, and therefore the usual village chores were difficult for him. No wood to chop, no fire to light in the stove. He wasn't used to hard work. Poppy had to show and tell him everything. Unprepared was the discovery that the house requires constant attention and repair, and to take care of the site must be regular. In winter, the snow is cleared every day, and water from the well for hundreds of meters to carry is not easy. All this depressed Andrew. Life in the countryside seemed different to him. As soon as I get a proper job in the city, we'll move, he kept telling Poppy. Deep down, he liked the countryside, fresh air, kind people, but life seemed too hard. Poppy supported him. She was ready to follow Andrew anywhere, even to the city, even to the end of the world. But time passed, and he never found a steady job, while Poppy's salary remained a stable source of income. People in the village began to whisper Poppy's young husband was living a life of leisure, sitting on her neck, never lifting a finger in the house. "I wish you'd married Jerry, Poppy," complained the neighbor. "He's a reliable fellow, he still loves her. But what about him? Riding around on your back, having fun with his buddies." Indeed, Andrew often gathered with local guys, organized feasts, went for a drive, sometimes with girls. There were rumors around the village about his infidelity, but Poppy didn't want to hear any of it. She ignored the talk, though deep down she was afraid for Andrew and possible trouble on the roads. Poppy hoped that having a baby would change family life. Fatherhood usually made men more responsible and mature. She still genuinely loved Andrew for his charm, his blue eyes, and his optimistic attitude. Next to him, the world seemed brighter and fuller. Without him, life seemed dull and gray. But Andrew's actions still offended her. Attempts to talk seriously usually ended in jokes, and Poppy forgot her worries again under his influence. When Poppy became pregnant, Andrew's reaction was not a happy one. He even suggested terminating the pregnancy, arguing that it was because they were young and their lives were unsettled. But Poppy insisted, feeling they would have a son. Andrew eventually supported his wife's decision and began to actively look for work, but without results. Still, Poppy was happy to see his efforts. The birth of their son Leo changed everything for Poppy. Her world now revolved around her son, evoking much stronger feelings than those she had had for her husband. Her view of Andrew had also changed. The woman now saw all the faults she had previously turned a blind eye to. His indifference to housework and lack of attention to his son were now conspicuous. Andrew put almost no effort into caring for the newborn. The entire family was now struggling to make ends meet, living on minimal payments from the government. It seemed that Andrew didn't even seek to make a difference. There had long been an opportunity to learn how to at least repair something around the house or chop wood, but he had not shown the slightest desire. With the arrival of the baby and Poppy's fascination with motherhood, Andrew tended to avoid the house, spending time with friends. He returned home late, often in a state of alcoholic intoxication, and did not get out of bed until dinner. To his wife's reproaches, Andrew now responded with harshness and even insults. "Why do you think I don't want to go home? Because I hate to look at you," he'd say, which was particularly depressing to Poppy. Pulling on the whole household, especially in the absence of money, was unbearably hard for Poppy. She was grateful for the help of neighbors. One of them could take care of the child while Poppy went out on business. Someone brought groceries. Even old baby clothes from neighborhood kids helped save money. While the local community supported Poppy, Andrew continued to cheat, promising to earn money in town but returning without it. Rumors reached Poppy about his entertaining in town with friends and young girls. Now she agreed with the opinion of the neighbors about her husband. He behaved unworthily, proved to be lazy and deceitful. Instead of giving the money he earned to his family, Andrew spent it on pleasure. Who do you listen to? Andrew resented Poppy when she questioned him. Your husband or the gossips? Those in town cheated again, gave less than they promised. Yeah, I went to a pub with a friend, had a little drink. There must be some joy in life. When Leo grew up, she decided to divorce because it was unbearable to live like that. Now, working and handling money made it easier. She realized that she could support a child on her own, but to support her son and her constantly unemployed husband, who likes to party, was much more difficult. Ever since Andrew had gone from an attractive blue-eyed guy to a local alcoholic, his charisma and charm had vanished as if they had never existed. The cloudy eyes, the unhealthy complexion, the gaunt look. Andrew was now taking money from his wife's purse, her paycheck he needed for drinks. He wasn't shy about getting funds that way. At first she could not even believe it, looking for other reasons. Maybe one of the children at school took it, maybe she herself put somewhere. But soon the woman realized that it was Andrew who was doing it. That realization was the last straw. For the first time in her life, Poppy gave her husband a real scandal. She expressed everything she thought about him in every possible way. At first he was shocked, and then he almost lashed out at her. Poppy thought that now, after such humiliation, Andrew would attack her. But her husband held back. He just swung. "Get out of my house and out of my life," Poppy said firmly, surprised at the determination in her voice. "We're getting a divorce. I don't want a husband like that." and our son shouldn't have to see that kind of example every day. Yes, Poppy did it for her son's sake first and foremost. Leo deserved to live in a calm and normal environment. A father who constantly spent his time partying and drinking was definitely not what he needed. It's best for everyone, they decided. Andrew, at first frightened, tried to convince Poppy not to make a rash move. For a while he even changed. He stopped drinking and found himself a more or less stable part-time job. However, his determination did not last long. Soon he returned to his old way of life. Poppy, seeing no other way out, divorced him and kicked him out of the house. Where he would go and where he would live now, she no longer cared. The main thing was to keep Andrew away from her and their child. Poppy was calmer and easier without him. It was a paradox. Andrew left and a new phase began in Poppy's life with her son. Life didn't get easier, but at least it became calmer and more orderly. Left alone with her son, it was as if Poppy had found freedom. Leo was still very young and did not have time to get attached to his father, who often disappeared from home or spent time on his adventures. Poppy worked hard. After working in the library, she washed the floors at school to bring home an extra penny. Leo did not need anything. There were clothes and delicious food and toys, although for this had to work very hard. The boy grew up on his own, like many village children, and at first Poppy thought that in time she would find it easier. But the burden of housework remained on her shoulders. Leo did not help around the house, finding a lot of excuses, from a lot of lessons to a pain in the head. At the same time, he always had time to go out with friends and ride his bike. Poppy was lenient about it, thinking it was important for a child to have a happy childhood, and didn't want to hurt her son by not being able to create a complete family for him. Is it really worth depriving Leo of these happy moments of childhood? Let him enjoy it, and when he grows up, he'll realize everything himself, Poppy thought. But as Leo grew up, the situation in the family did not get easier. The boy did not want to help around the house, and his interest in his studies was very superficial. He passed from class to class almost out of respect for his mother, who worked at the same school as a librarian. Poppy asked the teachers and talked to the headmaster. It would have been too shameful for Leo to stay on for a second year. The village treated the hard-working woman with warmth and understanding. But as the neighbor had predicted, everything was going to the end of their story will be sad. Already at school, Leo began to be fond of drinking, began to communicate with not very good company of older guys. Poppy tried to keep those guys away from Leo, even threatened them with the police, but they only laughed at her concern. The situation escalated when Leo was taken to the police for attempted shoplifting. He was released thanks to the local community's understanding of Poppy's situation, who was bearing the brunt of raising her son alone. The older Leo got, the clearer Poppy realized that he was following in his father's footsteps. She even saw it as a kind of punishment for having once kicked Andrew out, who soon finally rolled over and died. Poppy couldn't help but feel guilty about her ex-husband's fate and the fact that she seemed unable to stop the sad cycle of fate in her family. The woman's heart was breaking with pain and despair. Anna tried to talk to Leo, to convey to him the simple truths of life, hoping that she could still change his path. Her mother's words didn't seem to reach Leo, as his blank and indifferent stare testified. Perhaps Poppy should have started acting sooner, but the hustle and bustle of providing a family with a life distracted her, and she hadn't realized it at the time. She believed that the example of parents was the most important thing in education. But she hadn't considered the influence of heredity, which now had such a profound effect on Leo. He began to follow his father's path, taking money from Poppy's bag, coming home drunk, putting everything on his mother's shoulders, living for his own pleasures. After school, he didn't go on to further education, probably because of his poor grades. Poppy tried to get him a job on the farm, but he ran away after a few days. "What are you trying to do, make a slave out of me? I'll be busting my back out there," he complained to his mother, and accused her of depriving him of his parental support by kicking his father out. Leo's words hit Poppy where it hurt the most, that maybe she could have done something differently and prevented this outcome. In an instant, she felt very dizzy and realized that it was pointless to argue with her son. When Leo left for the city, Poppy was disturbed but didn't bother him, hoping that perhaps there was something different waiting for him there that wasn't in the village. The years passed and Leo was rarely in the village, sometimes calling his mother and telling her that he was doing well, that he had got a job in a factory, had qualified and was renting an apartment. Poppy, listening to his stories, despite all his past troubles, felt a restrained joy for her son. There was still a note of hope in her heart that Leo's life would turn out better than his father's. If that was indeed the case, Poppy could finally relax. Leo seemed to have found himself. However, Poppy couldn't fully believe him. Their family history was full of deception. But the reasoning that Leo was living somewhere and earning something was hopeful. Unfortunately, Leo chose the wrong path. He ended up in jail, but thanks to the fact that he was caught the first time, he was not in jail for long. In prison, his mother visited him, sympathizing with him. After being released early, Leo returned home serious and slimmed down. But the temporary return to the village did not detain him, and he went to the city again. Before leaving, he assured his mother that he could start a new life. "I've learned from my mistakes, become wiser," he said. And it seemed he had indeed changed. In the city, Leo married Margot, a nurse with a difficult fate. Leo introduced Margot to his mother as a respectful, pleasant, and kind woman who had been through some difficult trials in her life, including the loss of her son, Poppy. Seeing how Margot genuinely loved Leo, finally accepted her. She began to hope that after all the hardships and mistakes, her son would have a good life after all. Over the years, life settled down. Leo and Margot settled in the city and rarely visited Poppy, which was understandable because they were so busy. The most important thing for Poppy was to know that her son and his family were doing well. Margot and Leo had a daughter, Emily. The baby girl was incredibly sweet. Poppy was immensely happy for them. Margot had found the joy of motherhood again, and Leo, having become a father, had no doubt changed for the better, especially having such a beautiful daughter. Poppy, however, saw her granddaughter rarely. Each visit was a holiday for her. Her love for her granddaughter filled her heart. As she grew older, Poppy asked her son more and more often to bring Emily on vacation, assuring her that she would have fun in the countryside. "It's so nice here in the summer. It's a great place to be," she said. But the son waved off the suggestions, and Margot admitted that she was afraid to let her daughter go after losing her son. Poppy understood that. The terrible events had left a deep mark on Margot's soul, and her fear of losing loved ones was understandable. As time went on, Poppy felt the loneliness, especially when her health began to fail. She could no longer even walk to the well without resting. The local boys helped her, for which she was grateful. Poppy's spirits were kept high by the thought that her family was doing well. It seemed a miracle to her that Leo had finally found happiness in family life and stability. She was happy for him, although she was sad that he was making less frequent appearances in the village. It had been like this for several years. Occasionally, Leo would call to tell her about his health and share news. His granddaughter Emily had graduated from high school and entered law school. Margot, smart and beautiful, works but suffers from blood pressure, so she has no time to travel. Her son works in a factory. Oh, well, that's all right. The main thing is that he's getting his head on straight. The fact that he's inattentive and insensitive is just the way he is, and he's loved just as much for it. Poppy's heart condition worsened. She sighed as she watched a neighbor who had come to visit. Her health had given up completely. The local doctors could only throw up their hands and send her to the city for tests. There was no equipment here. She asked for help from her son, and although he did not refuse, but all postponed work, then the enrollment of her daughter, or himself, did not feel well. Poppy's health was deteriorating, and she could hardly move around the house. Neighbors helped by bringing food from the store. She was grateful. "I thought my days were numbered." Nobody's immortal. She was getting on in years. She marveled at every morning, feeling the joy of a new day. One day Leo arrived unexpectedly, all in a dark frame of mind. "Is there anything to eat?" he asked at once on the doorstep. Poppy shook her head with difficulty. "No, Leo, I'm not getting up at all. There's something left in the fridge, bread and sausage. Make yourself some sandwiches." Leo sighed heavily and went to the kitchen to boil the kettle and make sandwiches, forgetting about his mother's suggestion. He had always been like that, preoccupied only with himself. Such a character was influenced neither by upbringing nor scolding in childhood. "I left Margot," the son finally said. Poppy's heart clenched with pain. She was sure Leo had settled into the best possible life. What to do now? Why? She cheated on me, the traitor. And she made me work like a galley before that. She didn't see me as a human being. She said I had to succeed in my career, take care of my daughter, work at home. Without all that, she didn't need me. But son, that's just life. The man is the head of the family, his support and protection. Tried to comfort Poppy. Here we go. Do you think it's nice to know you're being used? We've built a life together, and now what? I'm allowed to ignore me and find someone wealthier. My daughter's turned against me too. Emily doesn't even want to see me anymore. Why is that? Because I reacted when I found out about her lover. You hit her. Poppy couldn't believe it. Well, not exactly. Just pushed and slapped her. I had a temper. Leo explained. Poppy could understand him. Margaret seemed to be behaving like Leo's father, drinking, partying, not working enough, not participating in household chores, expecting her husband to take care of her, thinking it was the norm. Margaret couldn't stand it and kicked the slacker out of her apartment. And apparently she got a decent man. You had a family? Did you ruin your own happiness? Poppy sighed. She cheated on me. She ruined the family, not me, replied the son. Poppy only sighed heavily. What are you going to do now? She asked. I guess I'm going to live here for a while. Shrugged his shoulders. When you're not well, I'll help you get better, and then we'll see. Are you sick? I'm very sick. Agreed, Poppy. Not long I have left. The medicine does not help much. You need to go to the city for examination. And then Leonid's face suddenly brightened. Anna noticed this moment, when something clicked in his head. Only then she could not even imagine to what conclusion Leo had reached. I'm taking you to the city, Leo said. We have to make arrangements with the doctor, find a car. Margaret borrowed my car in the divorce. Maybe she'll lend it to me for such an occasion. There was a spark of hope in Poppy's heart. Maybe her son really could help. He was worried and was already making plans to get his mother into hospital. She was pleased by her son's concern. The attention of grown-up children really is priceless. A few days passed. Leo disappeared in the city from morning till evening, coming home late at night and telling her that he was solving her problems. She had waited and hoped so much. Her condition began to worsen, though she didn't stop taking the medications prescribed by the local doctors. But afterward, she began to suspect. Leo, suddenly caring, was giving her pills. The size and taste of the medicine had changed. The woman noticed it, but didn't pay much attention to it, as well as to the fact of finding the vitamin pack in the trash. Only later in the woods, Poppy realized instead of vital drugs, her son gave her harmless vitamins. That's why she was feeling worse and worse. Leo must have thought she was fading too slowly. One afternoon, a car pulled up to the gate and Leo got out. It must have been Margot's after all. We're going into town, Leo said as he came into the house. I found the car. They're waiting at the hospital. The timing was good. Poppy was barely out of bed, weakening by the hour. Leo helped her pack and carried her mother in his arms to the car, constantly looking around. Only later did she realize why he did so. At that moment, almost everyone was busy, and no one should have noticed that he was taking his mother out of the village. The journey had begun. Poppy looked out the window curiously, enlivened by the sights she hadn't seen in so long. Her heart sang with joy, for her son was beside her and everything was going according to plan. Suddenly, Leo turned off the highway onto a country road, stopped the car, and helped her out. He set her down on the soft grass and said, "What are you doing?" She asked. "Sit a little, get some fresh air, and I'm here near." "I need to go to the bushes," replied the son. But Leo did not go in the direction of the bushes and returned to the car and started the engine. Poppy, dumbfounded, asked Leo, "What's going on?" Only now did she realize everything she had not noticed before. Leo said, "You're going to die soon anyway, but my house will be. I'm in debt, I'm being threatened, I'm just hastening the inevitable." "What on earth are you doing?" Poppy gasped, gripped by fear not for herself but for her son. "Don't worry, I won't get caught," Leo said confidently. "The neighbors already know you're better. They'll think you went for a walk and got lost. No one will know anything. Leo, how will you live after all this? Think about it." She tried to dissuade him. "I'll live. And you don't care anymore." He cut her off abruptly. Poppy stared after the car, not believing that her son had really left. She called out to him, begged him to stay, but in vain. Alone in the middle of the clearing, she cried with helplessness and loss. But soon she shook herself, found her footing and set off, following the sound of the motor. But she made a mistake and collapsed from exhaustion. It seemed her son's plan was on the verge of fulfillment. But then she was found. As she finished her story, Poppy looked at her amazed listeners with tears in her eyes. "You know everything now." "Wow," exhaled the girl. Baba Vera hugged Poppy tightly and asked, "And where's your Leo now?" "They were looking for him, determined my identity. Tried to find my son. He is my only relative." But they couldn't. He disappeared. Even put out a bolo. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe those to whom he owed something did something to him. Or he disappeared of his own free will, afraid that I would file a complaint against him. Now my heart towards my son is indifferent. It was New Year's Eve morning. Poppy's house smelled like a holiday pine tar, fresh baked goods, tangerines. Grandma Vera was cooking skillfully in the kitchen. Mary was getting ready for school, admiring herself in the mirror. Today was the last school day before the long-awaited vacation. Baba Vera and Mary were now living with Poppy. It was working out naturally after all that had happened. Granny and her granddaughter had nowhere to go and Poppy was having a hard time on her own. At the hospital, Poppy was examined and given appointments that made her noticeably better. She suspected that her recovery was not only due to the treatment, but also to the presence of people close to her. After all, to be needed by someone is happiness. Poppy regarded Vera as a friend and younger sister, and Mary as a granddaughter. They lived peacefully and amicably, each with their own difficult histories, but together they felt stronger. Poppy and Vera often discussed life, marveling at the strange way fate can change. Strangers become close and family become strangers.